Operation Sea Lion Succeeds Britain Falls to Nazi Germany Alternate History, written by Marcus Drayson, narrated by Gloria Feathers. Chapter 1: The Turning Point, Hitler's Gamble. The real Operation Sea Lion was fraught with logistical challenges, poor planning, and the formidable defenses of the British military. However, in this alternate history, key factors aligned to turn Hitler's gamble into a shocking success. The fall of Britain was not inevitable, but a series of strategic shifts, political missteps, and military breakthroughs paved the way for an event that would alter the course of history forever. One of the most significant changes was a decisive shift in Germany's air strategy. Instead of squandering resources on bombing civilian targets, the Luftwaffe focused relentlessly on eliminating the Royal Air Force. A more coordinated assault on British radar stations, airfields, and aircraft production facilities crippled Britain's ability to defend its skies. With the RAF severely weakened, the Germans gained air superiority far earlier than in reality, making an amphibious invasion far more feasible. German naval strategy also played a critical role. In this timeline, the Kriegsmarine, instead of being vastly outmatched by the Royal Navy, benefited from increased coordination with the Luftwaffe and U-boat support. The Channel crossing was still risky, but a well-timed offensive, bolstered by deception tactics and a more aggressive submarine campaign, created an opening for German forces to land successfully on British shores. Britain's internal situation contributed to its downfall as well. Political instability within Churchill's war cabinet, possibly exacerbated by dissenters pushing for a negotiated peace, hampered Britain's ability to mount a unified defense. In this alternate history, Lord Halifax and other appeasement advocates gained more influence, leading to hesitation at a critical moment. This delay in response allowed German forces to secure crucial beachheads before the British could mount an effective counterattack. Timing was also on Hitler's side. Instead of delaying the invasion into autumn, Germany launched Operation Sea Lion in late summer when the weather was still favorable. The rapid success of the landings, combined with the disruption of British defenses, led to a chaotic retreat toward London. Unlike in reality, where Britain's defenses held firm, the combination of superior German air support and internal political strife caused the British military to collapse under pressure. With the Wehrmacht advancing inland, the fate of Britain was sealed. Churchill, known for his unwavering resolve, faced an impossible situation. Would he attempt to rally resistance from the north, or was surrender the only option? The answer would shape not only the destiny of the British Isles, but also the entire world. The real Operation Sea Lion, plans and challenges. Operation Sea Lion was Adolf Hitler's plan to invade Britain in 1940, but it was a campaign that never materialized due to significant logistical and strategic hurdles. While the German military had achieved rapid victories across Europe, an invasion of Britain posed entirely new challenges. Unlike the Blitzkrieg successes in Poland and France, crossing the English Channel required naval dominance, something Germany never achieved. The initial plan for Operation Sea Lion called for a massive amphibious landing along the southern coast of England, targeting key locations such as Dover, Brighton, and Portsmouth. The Wehrmacht planned to deploy over 250,000 troops in the first wave, with additional forces following once a beachhead was secured. However, Germany faced a critical problem. Its navy was vastly inferior to the Royal Navy. While the Kriegsmarine had some powerful battleships and U-boats, it lacked the landing craft, transport ships, and overall maritime strength to challenge Britain's control of the Channel. One of the biggest challenges was air superiority. The plan relied heavily on the Luftwaffe defeating the Royal Air Force to clear the skies for an invasion. This led to the Battle of Britain, where German bombers and fighters attempted to break British air defenses. Despite initial successes, the Luftwaffe failed to cripple the RAF, which remained a formidable force. British radar systems and superior defensive tactics allowed them to repel German air assaults, preventing the necessary air dominance for a safe crossing. Logistics also proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. Germany had no experience conducting large-scale amphibious operations, and the invasion plan depended on a hastily assembled fleet of barges that were slow, vulnerable, and ill-suited for the rough waters of the Channel. These barges would have been easy targets for the Royal Navy, which could have devastated German transport ships before they ever reached British shores. Even if German troops had managed to land, they would have faced fierce resistance. Britain had mobilized home defense forces, fortified coastal defenses, and prepared a network of defensive lines inland. The British Army, while weakened from the evacuation at Dunkirk, still had hundreds of thousands of troops ready to defend their homeland. Furthermore, British supply lines were intact, while German forces would have struggled to maintain steady reinforcements and supplies across the Channel. Ultimately, Hitler postponed and eventually abandoned Operation Sea Lion, focusing instead on the invasion of the Soviet Union. The failure to launch the invasion marked a crucial turning point in World War II. Britain remained a base for Allied operations, ensuring that Germany would never fully dominate Western Europe. While Operation Sea Lion remains one of history's greatest what-if scenarios, in reality, it was an impractical and unrealistic plan doomed to failure. What changed? Key factors enabling success. In this alternate timeline, Operation Sea Lion did not end in failure. Several critical factors shifted in Germany's favor, allowing Hitler's invasion of Britain to succeed where it originally faltered. The balance of power in the air, the coordination of naval forces, and strategic errors on Britain's part all played a role in enabling the Wehrmacht to establish a foothold on British soil. The most decisive factor was Germany's approach to the Battle of Britain. Unlike in reality, where the Luftwaffe dispersed its efforts between military and civilian targets, the Germans remained focused on systematically dismantling British air defenses. By prioritizing attacks on radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories, the Luftwaffe crippled the RAF's ability to respond effectively. This shift in strategy resulted in the Luftwaffe gaining air superiority much sooner, giving German forces the cover they needed to cross the Channel. Another significant change was the Kriegsmarine's improved role in the invasion. In this version of events, Germany had prepared for an amphibious assault more effectively. Rather than relying on slow, vulnerable river barges, the Germans developed specialized landing craft and secured additional naval assets, possibly through capturing and repurposing French ships. The U-boat campaign also intensified, successfully neutralizing key elements of the Royal Navy's response force. While Germany still did not match British naval power, these adjustments allowed for a more organized and protected crossing. Britain's internal situation also played a part in its downfall. In this timeline, political divisions within Churchill's government ran deeper, with pro-appeasement voices gaining more traction. This led to delays in decision-making at critical moments, preventing a coordinated defense against the invasion. Additionally, a series of intelligence failures and miscalculations resulted in Britain underestimating Germany's ability to launch a full-scale assault before the winter of 1940. As a result, the British military was caught off guard when German forces landed in force. Timing and weather also favored Germany in this scenario. Instead of waiting until September, when worsening weather conditions would have complicated a channel crossing, Hitler launched the invasion in late summer under optimal conditions. The rapid advance of German troops, combined with paratrooper assaults on key inland positions, further disrupted British defenses. Without the chance to regroup, Britain struggled to mount an effective counteroffensive before German forces secured vital ports and supply lines. These key shifts focused air superiority, improved amphibious planning, Internal British instability and precise timing made Operation Sea Lion a success in this alternate history. With German boots firmly planted on British soil, the course of World War II was forever changed. The question now was not whether Britain would fall, but how long it could resist occupation. Germany's strategic advantage. In this alternate history where Operation Sea Lion succeeds, Germany possessed several critical advantages that enabled the invasion and eventual conquest of Britain. While the original plan faced insurmountable obstacles, key shifts in military strategy, resource allocation, and British vulnerabilities tipped the balance in favor of the Third Reich. One of Germany's greatest strengths was its battle-hardened military. By the summer of 1940, the Wehrmacht had already conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France with astonishing speed. German forces were highly experienced in blitzkrieg tactics, relying on fast-moving armored divisions, mechanized infantry, and well-coordinated air support. British defenses, though determined, were not prepared for a direct assault on their homeland, especially after the loss of much of their heavy equipment at Dunkirk. Air superiority played a decisive role in ensuring the success of the invasion. In this timeline, Germany made the critical decision to focus the Luftwaffe's efforts entirely on dismantling the Royal Air Force before launching Operation Sea Lion. The destruction of radar stations and airfields, combined with sustained attacks on British aircraft production, left the RAF unable to challenge German bombers and fighter escorts effectively. With the skies dominated by the Luftwaffe, German ground forces could land with far fewer losses, while British attempts at reinforcement and counterattacks were severely disrupted. Germany's control over Western Europe also provided a massive logistical advantage. The fall of France granted Germany access to ports along the Channel, significantly reducing the challenges of launching an invasion fleet. In this version of history, Germany prioritized naval preparations earlier, repurposing captured French and Dutch ships and developing improved landing craft. Additionally, a more aggressive U-boat campaign weakened British supply lines, ensuring that reinforcements and resources from the Empire could not reach Britain in time to turn the tide. Strategic deception further aided Germany's efforts. By feeding false intelligence to the British through double agents and radio misdirection, German commanders convinced British military planners that the invasion would target areas farther west near Devon and Cornwall. When the real attack came in the southeast, Britain's defenses were stretched too thin to repel the assault effectively. German paratroopers also played a key role, seizing vital infrastructure and cutting off communication lines before the main landing force arrived. Finally, Britain's geographic vulnerability was a crucial factor. Unlike previous German campaigns, the invasion of Britain did not require crossing vast distances or maintaining extended supply lines. The proximity of the British coast to occupied France allowed German forces to reinforce their positions quickly, ensuring steady supplies of troops, equipment, and fuel. Once a secure foothold was established, the rest of the country was at risk of falling in rapid succession. With these strategic advantages aligning, the fall of Britain became inevitable. What followed was a new, dark chapter in history, one where the last major obstacle to Hitler's domination of Western Europe had been removed. Chapter 2, The Battle of Britain, A Different Outcome. In the real timeline, the Battle of Britain ended in a decisive British victory, halting Hitler's plans for invasion. However, in this alternate history, the outcome is reversed, with the Luftwaffe emerging victorious. A series of crucial strategic adjustments, tactical missteps by the British, and sheer attrition turned the tide in Germany's favor, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion. The most significant shift came in the Luftwaffe's approach to air combat. Instead of diverting its focus to bombing London and civilian targets too early, as it did in reality, German command maintained relentless pressure on RAF airfields, radar installations, and aircraft factories. By systematically dismantling Britain's air defense network, the Luftwaffe ensured that the RAF could not effectively counter German bombers or protect the invasion forces when the time came. Germany also introduced more aggressive fighter escort tactics. In reality, the Luftwaffe's bombers often flew beyond the effective range of their fighter escorts, leaving them vulnerable to British Spitfires and Hurricanes. In this scenario, German command revised its strategy, prioritizing tight formations and fuel-efficient dogfighting techniques, ensuring that bombers received continuous cover throughout their missions. This prevented the RAF from achieving localized air superiority, a key factor in their real-world success. Another critical advantage for Germany was its intelligence operations. The Luftwaffe identified and targeted key RAF infrastructure with greater precision, destroying vital command centers and cutting off British supply chains. Additionally, through misinformation and deception tactics, the Germans misled British planners about their true objectives, causing the RAF to allocate resources inefficiently. Meanwhile, Britain suffered from a more severe pilot shortage in this version of events. Historically, the RAF relied on replacement pilots from the Commonwealth and other allied nations. But in this scenario, poor coordination and increased Luftwaffe raids on training facilities limited Britain's ability to replenish its fighter squadrons. With mounting losses and dwindling reinforcements, the RAF was unable to keep up with the Luftwaffe's sustained assaults. As the battle wore on, Germany finally achieved air superiority over southern England. With radar stations destroyed, RAF command in disarray, and aircraft losses exceeding production, Britain found itself unable to contest the skies. This victory meant that when Operation Sea Lion was finally launched, the Wehrmacht could cross the Channel without the constant threat of RAF interference. German bombers could now directly support the invasion forces, targeting British defensive positions, supply lines, and transport hubs with devastating effect. The defeat of the RAF marked the true beginning of Britain's downfall. Without control of its own airspace, the island nation was left vulnerable to an invasion it had desperately tried to prevent. The next phase of the war would take place not in the skies, but on British soil. Luftwaffe's tactical shift. The failure of the Luftwaffe in the real Battle of Britain was largely due to flawed strategy and shifting priorities. In this alternate history, Germany corrects these mistakes, implementing a tactical shift that ensures the destruction of the Royal Air Force and clears the path for invasion. Instead of engaging in a prolonged and inefficient bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe adopts a more precise, coordinated approach that systematically dismantles Britain's aerial defenses. One of the most important changes is the sustained focus on RAF airfields and radar stations. In reality, the Germans initially targeted these critical sites, but later diverted their efforts to bombing London, allowing the RAF to recover. In this scenario, the Luftwaffe does not make that mistake. Recognizing the importance of airfield infrastructure, the Germans launch relentless attacks on RAF bases, hangars, and runways, preventing British fighters from taking off in sufficient numbers. Simultaneously, the destruction of radar installations blinds British commanders, making it far more difficult to track incoming German raids. Another key shift is the improvement in Luftwaffe escort tactics. Historically, German bombers often outpaced their fighter escorts, leaving them vulnerable to British interception. In this alternate version, German High Command ensures that bombers fly in tighter formations with continuous fighter coverage. The Messerschmitt Bf 109s operate in longer patrol rotations, refueling at forward bases in occupied France to maintain pressure. This adjustment prevents the RAF from achieving localized air superiority, as German fighters are always present to counterattack. The Luftwaffe also adopts better coordination between its bomber wings. Instead of launching scattered raids at different times, the Germans conduct synchronized mass assaults, overwhelming British defenses. By attacking multiple targets simultaneously, they stretched the RAF's limited resources, forcing British commanders to make impossible choices about where to deploy their dwindling forces. This concentrated strategy allows the Luftwaffe to inflict far greater damage in a shorter period. Additionally, Germany strengthens its night bombing capabilities earlier than in reality. By using advanced navigation techniques and intelligence gathered from spies in Britain, the Luftwaffe effectively cripples aircraft production facilities and fuel depots under the cover of darkness. These attacks further weaken Britain's ability to replace lost aircraft, leaving the RAF unable to sustain prolonged combat. With these tactical improvements, the Luftwaffe achieves what it failed to in real history: total dominance of British airspace. By the time Operation Sea Lion is set in motion, the RAF is no longer a viable fighting force. The skies over the English Channel belong to Germany, ensuring that when the invasion begins, the Wehrmacht will land with the full might of air support behind it. Britain, once defiant, now faces the terrifying reality of German troops marching on its shores. IF's defeat and the loss of air superiority. The Royal Air Force was Britain's primary line of defense against a German invasion, but in this alternate history, it succumbs to relentless Luftwaffe pressure. The loss of air superiority over southern England is the decisive moment that dooms Britain to occupation. Without control of its own skies, the island nation can no longer prevent an amphibious landing, leaving it vulnerable to the full force of the Wehrmacht. The first stage of the RAF's downfall comes with the systematic destruction of its infrastructure. Unlike in reality, where the Luftwaffe prematurely shifted focus to bombing London, German air commanders remain committed to crippling Britain's ability to fight in the air. Repeated attacks on airfields in Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire destroy hangars, fuel depots, and repair stations, making it increasingly difficult for the RAF to launch counterattacks. Runways are left cratered, forcing pilots to take off from secondary, less equipped bases farther inland. This logistical strain reduces the RAF's ability to respond quickly to German raids. Radar stations, Britain's greatest advantage in detecting enemy aircraft, are also systematically targeted and destroyed. In real history, these installations remained functional throughout the Battle of Britain, giving the RAF critical early warnings. In this alternate timeline, the Luftwaffe prioritizes knocking them out in the first phase of its air campaign, leaving British commanders blind to incoming attacks. Without radar guidance, RAF fighters struggle to intercept German bombers in time, allowing the Luftwaffe to strike British targets with near impunity. Another key factor in the RAF's defeat is the severe loss of pilots. Historically, Britain was able to replenish its squadrons with pilots from the Commonwealth and occupied Europe. But in this scenario, German air raids on training facilities and logistical hubs disrupt Britain's ability to produce replacements. Every downed RAF aircraft now represents not just the loss of a machine, but an irreplaceable pilot. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, with air bases close to the English Channel, is able to recover injured pilots and return them to combat much more efficiently. As losses mount, the RAF is forced to retreat northward, abandoning southern England to German control. Fighter squadrons relocate to airfields around Birmingham and Manchester, but by this point it is too late. The Luftwaffe dominates the skies over the invasion beaches, providing continuous air cover for German landing forces. British ground defenses, already strained, now have no air support to counter the advancing Wehrmacht. With the RAF effectively neutralized, the final barrier protecting Britain is gone. The Luftwaffe's triumph ensures that when German troops land on English soil, they do so with overwhelming aerial superiority. The battle for Britain is no longer fought in the air. It is now a struggle for survival on the ground. British morale and government response. As the Luftwaffe steadily dismantles Britain's air defenses, the nation's morale begins to crumble under the relentless pressure. The failure to maintain air superiority takes its toll on both civilians and military personnel, shaking the confidence that had defined Britain's resistance. The government, led by Winston Churchill, faces growing internal divisions as the once unified resolve to resist the Nazis begins to falter under the mounting weight of disaster. Initially, Britain's people were resolute. The outbreak of war had unified the nation, and there was a collective determination to hold out against the Nazi threat. However, as the Battle of Britain drags on and the Luftwaffe's attacks grow increasingly effective, cracks in this unity begin to appear. The constant bombardment of civilian areas, particularly London, has a profound psychological impact on the population. While the Blitz in reality was met with resilience and the famous keep calm and carry on spirit, in this alternate history, the unrelenting air raids on critical infrastructure, homes, and hospitals begin to break the public's will to fight. The government's response, however, remains decisive for a time. Churchill, despite his famous speeches rallying the nation, faces increased pressure from within his own ranks. Proponents of a negotiated peace with Nazi Germany gain strength, arguing that the situation is no longer tenable. Lord Halifax, among others, begins to push for a settlement with Hitler, suggesting that Britain may have no choice but to accept a German occupation or a formal peace. This division within the British cabinet weakens the war effort and fuels uncertainty. The prospect of a negotiated peace, which would have avoided the horrors of occupation, is seen by many as the only viable solution. Despite the growing support for peace talks, Churchill stands firm, at least publicly, against any notion of surrender. However, the relentless pressure of continued bombardments, the loss of air superiority, and the mounting casualties strain Britain's war cabinet. A series of failed counterattacks, alongside intelligence failures that underestimated the timing of the German invasion, further erodes the public's confidence in the government's ability to protect the nation. The sense of inevitability begins to settle in. As German forces land along the southern coast of England, the government, unable to maintain the military and civilian resistance, begins to consider an evacuation to the north, where it hopes to regroup in Scotland or potentially to relocate the government abroad. But by then, it is too late. Without air cover or the support of a unified populace, Britain falls into disarray. The country that once stood as the last bastion of resistance against Nazi tyranny succumbs to the reality of occupation, the result of both external force and internal division. Chapter 3. The Invasion Begins. Landings on British Soil. With the skies now firmly under German control, the stage is set for Operation Sea Lion to unfold. The Luftwaffe has successfully cleared the air of British defenders, and the Royal Navy, already weakened by U-boat attacks and diversionary tactics, struggles to mount an effective defense. The invasion of Britain, which had once seemed an impossible feat, is now a terrifying reality. German forces begin their amphibious assault on southern England, landing in a series of key coastal areas. The initial landings take place in the early hours of the morning, when low visibility and a heavy mist provide the perfect cover for the first wave of German troops. The main thrust of the invasion targets the southeast, around the Kent and Sussex coasts, where the Germans have calculated the British defenses are weakest. At these points, a combination of paratrooper landings and amphibious assaults overwhelm the stretched British forces. German paratroopers, having already secured key infrastructure in advance, disable communication lines and sabotage transportation routes, ensuring that reinforcements cannot reach the beleaguered defenders. The Wehrmacht uses its superior mobility to quickly advance inland, pushing through defensive positions that had been hastily prepared in the previous months. British forces, though brave, are disorganized and under-equipped compared to the highly trained and mechanized German units. The lack of air cover and supply disruptions leave the British unable to respond effectively. The Royal Navy's attempt to halt the landings is a desperate affair. With only a fraction of its strength intact, it cannot match the might of the German invasion fleet, which has been bolstered by captured French vessels and improved landing craft. The Luftwaffe continues its relentless attacks on British ships, reducing the Royal Navy's ability to interfere with the landings. In the initial hours of the invasion, German forces established several beachheads, allowing them to bring in reinforcements, heavy equipment, and supplies. The rapid movement of German mechanized infantry and tank divisions creates a wedge between the defenders, who are unable to mount a coordinated counterattack. The British Army, already stretched thin by the evacuation of Dunkirk, faces the crushing reality of fighting an invasion on multiple fronts. The psychological impact of the landings is immediate. British civilians, who have been enduring the air raids for months, now witness the unthinkable: German soldiers walking on British soil. The feeling of helplessness and impending occupation spreads quickly throughout the country. The invasion, once a distant threat, is now a brutal reality. As the Germans march further inland, the British government begins to consider its options for retreat and eventual surrender. The battle for Britain has entered its most desperate phase, with the outcome seeming more inevitable by the hour. German forces crossed the Channel. With the Luftwaffe having established dominance in the skies and the Royal Navy struggling to defend the coastline, the German forces are ready to execute the most daring phase of Operation Sea Lion, crossing the English Channel. This feat, once considered an insurmountable challenge, is now a reality. The German invasion fleet, composed of a mix of naval vessels, requisitioned French ships, and newly developed landing craft, begins its journey across the Channel in the early hours of the morning. The crossing is a carefully timed operation, exploiting both the favorable weather conditions and the strategic advantages Germany has secured through months of preparation. Unlike the original failed Operation Sea Lion, where the Germans were plagued by logistical issues and naval challenges, this version sees a much more streamlined effort. German Naval Command has adapted to the constraints of the Channel, using a combination of smaller, more maneuverable ships to reduce vulnerability to British attacks. The invasion force is supported by a sustained U-boat campaign, which has significantly disrupted British shipping routes, further hampering the Royal Navy's ability to mount an effective defense. The German fleet moves in coordinated waves, with a large portion of the invasion force making landfall near the southern coast of England. The timing of the invasion is crucial. The Germans launched their assault during a low tide, making it easier to land heavy equipment and troops while minimizing the risk of British counterattacks. The Wehrmacht's amphibious assault is spearheaded by specially trained troops, including Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, who are dropped ahead of the main landing force to secure vital infrastructure such as bridges, railways, and communication hubs. These paratroopers work quickly to cut off any chance of a British counteroffensive. Once ashore, the Germans waste no time in pushing inland. The rapidity of their advance, combined with their superior mechanized units, causes chaos among the defending British forces. The terrain of southern England, although familiar to the British, is quickly overcome by the overwhelming force of the German army. The Luftwaffe continues to provide air support, strafing British defenses and providing reconnaissance for ground operations. British defenders, already weary from months of bombings and unable to gain air superiority, find themselves increasingly outmatched. The psychological shock of German troops stepping onto British soil further diminishes British morale. Civilians, once steadfast in their resolve, now witness the reality of invasion. The speed of the German advance catches the British military off guard, and before long, key cities and strategic points fall under German control. The Channel crossing, which had once seemed an impossible task, has been achieved with startling efficiency. The invasion is underway, and Britain's struggle for survival has entered a new, far more desperate phase. Fighting on the beaches. Initial clashes. As German forces make their way ashore, the first clashes between the invaders and British defenders unfold along the southern coastline. The landings, though meticulously planned, are met with desperate resistance from British soldiers, civilians, and makeshift militias, all of whom have been preparing for this moment, but are not fully equipped or organized to face the overwhelming might of the Wehrmacht. The beaches of Kent and Sussex quickly become a battleground where the stakes could not be higher. The Germans, having secured their initial beachheads, move swiftly to establish a foothold, but the British defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fight with every ounce of determination. British infantry, supported by hastily arranged artillery positions, attempt to hold key positions on the coast, knowing full well that the success of the entire defense effort rests on preventing the Germans from advancing further inland. The British forces rely heavily on coastal defenses, such as gun emplacements and anti-tank weapons, to slow down the advancing mechanized German units. In the early hours, small-scale skirmishes break out as German infantry and armored units push toward key objectives. The British Army, stretched thin and in a state of disarray, puts up a fierce but disorganized resistance. British soldiers engage in guerrilla-style tactics, attempting to harass German forces with sporadic ambushes, while civilians join the fight, armed with whatever they can find: rifles, hunting shotguns, and even improvised explosives. Despite the brave defense, the British forces are forced to yield ground quickly. The sheer strength of the German advance, supported by infantry, tanks, and the continuous bombardment from German artillery and the Luftwaffe, soon becomes overwhelming. The Luftwaffe plays a critical role in the initial clashes. German bombers and fighters continue their relentless assault on British positions, targeting military units, communication lines, and reinforcements trying to reach the front lines. The once reliable RAF is now in disarray, unable to contest the skies over southern England. The German air superiority allows for constant tactical bombardments, softening up British positions and making any coordinated defense almost impossible. While the British resistance is fierce and the beachhead holds for a short time, the German forces' overwhelming numbers, superior tactics, and relentless air support soon push the defenders back. The beaches, once a place of hope and resolve, quickly turn into zones of retreat. The initial clashes show the bravery of British soldiers and civilians, but they also reveal the fatal disadvantage Britain faces: a lack of resources, air support, and a unified military response. As the German forces continue their advance, Britain's fate begins to feel more inevitable. The battle on the beaches is a bitter, bloody chapter, but it is only the beginning of a much larger conflict that will determine the future of the island. The collapse of British coastal defenses. As the German invasion force presses forward, the British coastal defenses, once considered impenetrable, begin to collapse under the relentless assault. Initially, the defenders on the beaches put up a stubborn resistance, but the overwhelming might of the German forces soon proves too much. The carefully prepared defense lines, stretching from Dover to the Solent, begin to disintegrate under the combined weight of Luftwaffe bombardments, artillery barrages, and the steadily advancing Wehrmacht. One of the first major blows to the British defense comes from the destruction of coastal artillery positions. These emplacements, which were supposed to provide a crucial line of defense against the German landings, are systematically targeted by German bombers. The Luftwaffe, having gained near-total air superiority, conducts near-constant strikes on these defensive positions, rendering them useless. Many of the large coastal guns are destroyed or damaged beyond repair within hours of the initial landing, leaving the British defenders without key firepower. The British Army, already stretched thin due to the logistical constraints of defending such a large coastline, is unable to quickly reinforce its positions. As the German forces land, the advancing Wehrmacht units quickly secure key points, such as supply depots, railways, and bridges, cutting off vital reinforcements and supplies from reaching the defenders. The lack of coordination between different units and branches of the British military further exacerbates the situation, leading to confusion and disarray among the troops on the ground. In the absence of effective counterattacks, the German forces, with their superior mobility, pushed through defensive lines with alarming speed. Tanks, motorized infantry, and paratroopers work in concert to overwhelm isolated British positions. The British defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, are forced into a retreat, unable to hold the line. The terrain itself, open beaches and farmland, offers little cover for the defenders, allowing German forces to press the attack relentlessly. The collapse of the coastal defenses is compounded by the inability of the Royal Navy to intervene effectively. The German fleet, with its overwhelming numbers and the continued presence of U-boats, ensures that British warships cannot approach the landing zones without risk of destruction. The British attempt to send reinforcements across the Channel is thwarted by constant air and naval bombardment, further sealing the fate of the coastal defenses. As the German forces gain control of key coastal cities like Dover, Portsmouth, and Brighton, the British position becomes increasingly untenable. The once proud coastal defenses, which had been relied upon to keep Britain safe from invasion, are now in ruins. The collapse of these defenses signals the beginning of the end for Britain's ability to resist the German onslaught, as the Wehrmacht advances further inland, tightening its grip on the island. Chapter 4: The Fall of London. By the time the German forces reach London, the city's defenses have been shattered, and the government's capacity to resist the occupation has nearly collapsed. The Luftwaffe, having already crippled British air defenses and neutralized coastal artillery, turns its full attention to the heart of Britain's political and military power. The German strategy is one of precision bombing, targeting key infrastructure, bridges, railways, power stations, and government buildings, in order to break both the spirit of the population and the logistical backbone of the British war effort. In the days leading up to the invasion of London, the city endures near constant aerial bombardment. The once thriving metropolis, known for its resilience during the Blitz of 1940, now faces a far more intense assault. The Luftwaffe, having learned from past mistakes, carefully targets not only military sites, but also civilian areas to maximize disruption. The resulting destruction is catastrophic, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and fires raging uncontrollably. The British civilian population, already reeling from months of air raids, is now in a state of total disarray. The British military, unable to mount an effective defense due to the loss of air superiority and the collapse of coastal defenses, can do little to stop the advance of German forces. The army's attempts to regroup and form a defensive line around London falter as German mechanized units swiftly move through the countryside. As German infantry and tanks approach the outskirts of the city, British forces, disheartened and poorly equipped, are pushed back, unable to hold key positions. The Royal Artillery, once a formidable force, is decimated by German airstrikes, and British infantry units find themselves increasingly isolated, with no hope of receiving reinforcements. As German troops close in on London, panic spreads throughout the city. The government, realizing the inevitable, prepares for evacuation, with key officials relocating to Scotland or considering escape to North America. But the logistics of such an operation are unfeasible in the face of an oncoming invasion. The mass exodus of civilians only adds to the chaos. Despite Churchill's calls for defiance and resistance, morale among the civilian population collapses. The reality of German occupation sets in as Wehrmacht forces, now with air and ground superiority, breach the city's defenses. By the time German troops march through the streets of London, there is little left to resist them. The government is effectively incapacitated, the military overwhelmed, and the population in disarray. London, Britain's last stronghold, falls under Nazi control. This marks a devastating turning point in the war, as the symbol of British resolve is silenced and the country's fate now lies in the hands of its invaders. The occupation of London is the final blow to Britain's ability to continue the fight, and the nation's collapse becomes an increasingly inevitable reality. The Wehrmacht advances inland. With London now under German control, the Wehrmacht begins its relentless march inland, cutting through the heart of Britain with brutal efficiency. The fall of the capital city was a devastating psychological blow, but the Germans know that the war is far from over. The British military, already fragmented and demoralized, has little left to oppose the German juggernaut as it drives deeper into the country. The Wehrmacht, equipped with fresh reinforcements and supported by a constant flow of supplies, pushes forward with unyielding force. German tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery units advance with well-coordinated precision, exploiting the gaps in British defenses. The terrain, though familiar to the British, is no match for the mobility of the German forces. Rural areas, towns, and villages fall quickly as the Wehrmacht moves with remarkable speed, bypassing fortified positions and isolating any attempts at organized resistance. British units, already stretched thin from months of fighting, struggle to regroup. The lack of air support following the collapse of the RAF leaves them vulnerable to aerial bombardment as German fighters and bombers continue their unrelenting attacks. The German strategy is to strike swiftly and decisively, ensuring that the British forces cannot mount any meaningful counterattacks. The British Army, having already been decimated along the southern coastline, has little capacity to resist the Germans as they push further north. Civilians, now displaced by the advancing German forces, flood into smaller towns and rural areas, seeking refuge in what remains of their homes. But these areas are soon overrun as the Germans move with methodical precision, taking advantage of any terrain feature to outflank and outmaneuver the defenders. The British resistance begins to fragment even further as many units find themselves cut off from the central command. In some areas, local militias and civilian groups try to organize a last-ditch effort to halt the Germans, but without proper coordination, these efforts are largely futile. The widespread destruction caused by German airstrikes has left critical infrastructure in ruins, and supply lines are non-existent, further hindering any attempts at organized defense. By the time the Wehrmacht reaches the Midlands, the British resistance is little more than a series of isolated pockets of fighters. The fall of London has shattered the resolve of much of the population, and the sheer scale of the German advance has overwhelmed any remaining strategic coherence within the British forces. The Wehrmacht's advance inland is marked by relentless efficiency, leaving behind a country that is broken, divided, and on the brink of collapse. The occupation of Britain, once thought impossible, now appears inevitable as the Germans tighten their grip on the island. Urban the capital. As the German forces make their way through London, the city is transformed into a war zone. What was once the vibrant heart of British life becomes the stage for brutal urban warfare, where every street, every building, and every alley becomes a battleground. With the fall of most of the country, the British government's last stand is centered in the capital. Military units, civilian militias, and desperate citizens fight tooth and nail to defend their city. But the Germans, equipped with superior firepower and tactical advantage, show no mercy. The Wehrmacht's strategy is to clear the city block by block, using the full force of their mechanized units and infantry to secure each area. German tanks and armored vehicles roll through the streets, crushing anything in their path, while infantry squads advance cautiously, engaging in close-quarters combat with British defenders. The Luftwaffe continues its aerial bombardment, making airstrikes on key targets such as bridges, government buildings, and military strongholds, but also indiscriminately pounding civilian areas. The result is a city in flames, with smoke filling the air and the constant sound of explosions echoing through the streets. British resistance, though fierce, is often disorganized. Civilians who had taken up arms in the wake of the German invasion fight alongside remnants of the British Army. Makeshift barricades are set up in narrow alleyways and along main streets, but they provide little protection against the heavy German artillery and tanks. Snipers take to the rooftops, attempting to slow the German advance, but they are often picked off by German sharpshooters or overwhelmed by concentrated artillery fire. Street fighting becomes brutal and relentless as small groups of British soldiers and partisans attempt to delay the inevitable, knowing that the chances of victory are slim. The Germans adapt their tactics to the urban environment, employing a combination of infantry, heavy artillery, and mechanized support to break through entrenched positions. They use their superior numbers and coordination to systematically clear buildings, floor by floor, with overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, provides close air support, targeting resistance strongholds and key military installations with deadly precision. The urban terrain, once a strength for defenders, now becomes a disadvantage as the German forces demonstrate unparalleled proficiency in urban warfare. As the British defenders retreat further into the city, desperation sets in. The constant bombardment and the encroaching German forces leave little room for hope. The once proud capital of Britain is slowly being reduced to rubble. In the face of overwhelming force and mounting casualties, the fall of London is no longer a matter of if, but when. Urban warfare in the capital becomes the final, tragic chapter in Britain's desperate fight for survival. The British government in crisis. As German forces tighten their grip on Britain, the British government faces an unprecedented crisis. The swift collapse of London and the relentless advance of the Wehrmacht have left the once mighty British administration struggling to maintain control. The leadership, once resolute in its commitment to resist, is now torn between the desire to fight on and the harsh reality of imminent defeat. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had led the charge for defiance against Nazi Germany, finds himself in an impossible situation. With much of London in ruins and the government itself incapacitated, Churchill and his cabinet are forced into a series of emergency meetings, held in secret locations far from the capital. There, the discussion centers on whether it is still possible to continue the fight or if Britain must come to terms with its inevitable occupation. The crushing weight of the invasion, coupled with the loss of air superiority and the collapse of military defenses, leaves little room for optimism. At the heart of the crisis is the British public's morale. The government had long relied on the resolve of the British people to withstand the hardships of war, but with the capital fallen and the countryside overrun, public faith begins to falter. Rumors of surrender or peace negotiations with the Germans begin to spread, and discontent grows. The government, once a symbol of resistance, begins to fracture under the pressure. Some members of the cabinet argue for continued resistance, believing that Britain can hold out, but others, particularly those from regions already under German occupation, begin to advocate for a negotiated peace. The threat of civil unrest looms as widespread panic and fear threaten to undo any remaining semblance of unity. In an effort to salvage some form of stability, the British government relocates to the north of England, but even this move proves ineffective. The Wehrmacht's advance is relentless, and British officials are soon faced with the harsh reality that even the northern cities may soon fall. The government's ability to govern is undermined as communication lines are severed and resources become increasingly scarce. Desperation sets in, with ministers arguing over how to handle the increasingly fragmented military and civilian response. The notion of Britain standing alone against Germany grows increasingly unrealistic. As the British government fractures and the country faces collapse, the dream of a free Britain grows ever more distant. The once unified resolve of the nation, embodied by its leadership and people, is tested to its breaking point. With the fall of London and the growing crisis within the government, Britain is on the verge of surrender, and the possibility of a Nazi occupation of the island becomes an inescapable reality. The British government, once the symbol of defiance against tyranny, now faces its darkest hour. Chapter 5: The Royal Family and Churchill's Fate. As the German forces advance and Britain's fate teeters on the edge of collapse, the royal family and Prime Minister Winston Churchill face the most difficult decisions of their lives. The once unshakable symbols of British unity, King George VI and his family, now find themselves at the crossroads of survival and surrender. Meanwhile, Churchill, who had been the face of resistance, grapples with his own grim future as the war's tides turn decisively against the nation. King George VI, having already led the nation through the dark days of the Blitz, must now decide whether to stay in the country or evacuate to ensure the continuity of the monarchy. With the Germans rapidly closing in on London, the king's advisors recommend evacuation to Canada or even to the United States to prevent capture or assassination. The royal family's safety becomes a national concern, but there are also those who argue that their departure would deal a devastating blow to British morale. The king's decision is agonizing, torn between the responsibility of his duty and the safety of his family and nation. Ultimately, the royal family is evacuated to the United States, marking a profound shift in Britain's spirit. The monarchy's relocation, although strategically sound, undermines the sense of national unity and makes it clear that the British leadership believes defeat is inevitable. Churchill, meanwhile, faces the dilemma of whether to stay and continue fighting or to consider a negotiated peace with Nazi Germany. In the early stages of the invasion, Churchill is determined to resist to the bitter end, appealing to the nation for perseverance. However, as the Wehrmacht's advance becomes unstoppable and London falls, Churchill's resolve begins to crack. The British military is decimated, the government is in disarray, and the population is losing hope. Sensing the inevitability of surrender, some members of Churchill's cabinet begin to press for peace talks with the Germans, urging the Prime Minister to negotiate terms that might spare the country further devastation. Churchill's legacy as the steadfast leader of British resistance is now in jeopardy. While he remains a symbol of defiance, the reality of Germany's occupation forces him into a difficult position. The possibility of a negotiated peace with Hitler hangs in the air, and Churchill, though unwilling to admit defeat, is forced to face the consequences of his earlier decisions. His reputation, long built on defiance and unyielding leadership, is now at stake. As Britain crumbles, Churchill's fate remains uncertain. Some speculate that he will be arrested or even executed by the Nazis, while others hope that he will escape to lead a government in exile. The royal family's departure from Britain, combined with the crumbling of Churchill's leadership, signals the end of an era and marks the final stages of Britain's fall to Nazi Germany. The monarchy and the Prime Minister, once symbols of strength, now face the overwhelming question of survival in a world where defeat seems all but certain. Evacuation or capture? The royal family's escape plan. As the German forces close in on London, the royal family is faced with a dire choice: stay and risk capture, or evacuate the country in a last-ditch effort to preserve the monarchy. With the Wehrmacht advancing rapidly and the government's infrastructure collapsing, the safety of King George VI and his family becomes paramount to the survival of the British monarchy and what remains of the country's leadership. The decision to evacuate is fraught with tension, as the royal family must weigh the implications for national morale and the message it would send to the British people. In the days following the fall of London, as the threat of Nazi occupation becomes increasingly clear, members of the royal family's inner circle begin formulating evacuation plans. Several options are discussed, with Canada and the United States being considered as potential destinations for the monarch. These countries, with their relative safety, would offer a refuge from the German onslaught, allowing the monarchy to continue leading from abroad. However, the idea of fleeing the country presents a dilemma. For many, the very notion of abandoning the British people in their hour of need is unthinkable. The monarchy has long been a symbol of national unity and resilience, and their departure would be a symbolic blow to the spirit of the nation. King George VI, while acknowledging the strategic necessity of safeguarding his family, is deeply torn. He has led the country through the turmoil of the Blitz, and abandoning Britain at this moment feels like a betrayal to the very people who have stood with him. Yet, the reality of the situation forces him to consider the survival of the monarchy above all else. After much deliberation and under the advisement of his closest officials, it is decided that the royal family must evacuate. The King, Queen Elizabeth, and their children are to be moved secretly to Canada, where they can regroup and continue to serve as a symbol of hope for the British people. The escape plan, though secretive, is executed with military precision. The royal family is hidden in the dead of night, escorted by a small but loyal security detail. Despite the efforts to keep their departure quiet, word of the evacuation leaks, and soon the British population learns that their monarchy has fled. For many, this is a crushing blow. The image of the royal family, once seen as the heart of Britain, leaving the country sends a devastating message: Britain is lost. While the royal family's escape secures their survival, it is a moment that signals the end of Britain's resistance. The monarchy, now exiled, becomes a figurehead for what is left of the country's spirit, but the image of their flight from Britain is forever etched in the minds of the British people. The monarchy may have survived, but the dream of a free and independent Britain has been shattered. Churchill's defiance, last stand or surrender. As the German forces push deeper into Britain and London falls, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stands at a pivotal crossroads in history. The resolve that had defined his leadership during the early stages of the war now faces its ultimate test. With the Wehrmacht occupying much of the country and the British military in disarray, Churchill must decide whether to continue resisting or to negotiate a peace with Nazi Germany. His defiance had once been a rallying cry for the nation, but now, as Britain teeters on the brink of collapse, his unwavering determination is met with growing pressure from within his own government and the British public. Churchill, who had vowed to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets, finds himself confronting the possibility of surrender as the odds continue to mount against him. As German forces advance into the heart of England and the royal family flees the country, some of Churchill's cabinet ministers begin to call for peace talks with Hitler, believing that further resistance is futile. They argue that Britain's position is untenable and that a negotiated peace might spare the country from total destruction. But Churchill, ever the symbol of British defiance, resists these calls. In his view, surrender would not only be a personal failure, but a betrayal of everything Britain had stood for during the war. To give in to Hitler would mean the loss of Britain's freedom, its identity, and its place in the world. His speeches, though growing increasingly filled with a sense of foreboding, still call for the British people to stand firm, to endure whatever hardships may come. He recognizes, however, that the situation is growing increasingly hopeless, and the weight of leadership becomes heavier by the day. In a desperate attempt to rally the nation, Churchill makes one last plea for resistance. But even he knows that his time as the nation's unyielding leader may soon be over. With the Germans poised to capture the remaining strongholds of British resistance, Churchill faces the grim reality that his government's ability to fight is reaching its end. The decision of whether to surrender or to continue the fight becomes a personal battle for Churchill. Would he be remembered as the leader who stood defiant to the last, or as the one who, when faced with overwhelming odds, chose to save his country from utter destruction by negotiating peace? With the fall of London, the end of Britain's resistance seems inevitable, and Churchill's fate, along with that of the nation, is sealed. The end of the British War Cabinet. As the German forces continue their relentless advance through Britain, the very fabric of the British War Cabinet begins to unravel. Once the beating heart of British decision-making during the darkest days of the conflict, the War Cabinet, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, now faces its final crisis. With the collapse of London, the fall of key military positions, and the disintegration of the country's infrastructure, the government is faced with insurmountable pressure to make difficult choices. In the face of an unstoppable enemy, the War Cabinet is divided on the future course of action. Some members, particularly those with ties to the military and intelligence community, advocate for continued resistance. They argue that even though Britain is on the brink of defeat, holding out could pave the way for a future counterattack or foreign intervention. However, as the possibility of a full German occupation looms larger, the more pragmatic voices begin to emerge. These cabinet members, disillusioned with the prospect of further bloodshed and seeing no way to turn the tide, argue for a peace settlement with Nazi Germany. The growing rift within the War Cabinet is further exacerbated by the evacuation of the royal family. With King George VI and Queen Elizabeth relocated to North America, the symbolism of the monarchy's departure deeply shakes the government's confidence. If the royal family, the embodiment of Britain's unity and spirit, could no longer stand in Britain, what was left to preserve? This loss of morale permeates the cabinet meetings, and those who had once stood firm in their resolve begin to question whether it is better to negotiate peace than to continue a futile resistance. Churchill, ever the symbol of defiance, stands firm against any notion of surrender. But the weight of the situation begins to take its toll. With London in ruins, the military in disarray, and Britain's infrastructure collapsing, Churchill is faced with the very real possibility that his government can no longer function. The final blow comes when key ministers, previously loyal to the cause, resign in protest, citing the hopelessness of the situation. The War Cabinet, once a powerful symbol of Britain's resolve, fractures completely. In its final days, the War Cabinet ceases to operate as a cohesive unit. No longer capable of making critical decisions, it becomes clear that the British government is no longer able to effectively lead the nation. The end of the War Cabinet marks the symbolic end of Britain's resistance. The government, now fractured and unable to continue its struggle, must face the reality of surrender and the occupation of Britain by Nazi Germany. The proud institution that once led the fight for freedom and democracy is dismantled in the face of total defeat. Chapter 6: The Occupation of Britain. With the surrender of the British government and the fall of London, the island of Britain is officially occupied by Nazi Germany. The once proud nation, which had fought so valiantly to resist Hitler's advance, now finds itself under the iron grip of the Third Reich. The occupation begins with the systematic deployment of German forces across the British Isles, with troops stationed in key cities, industrial areas, and transportation hubs. The streets of London, once a symbol of defiance, are now patrolled by the Nazi military, and the Union Jack is replaced by the swastika. The initial stage of the occupation is marked by brutal efficiency. The German military imposes martial law, and curfews are established in all major cities. The British population, already weakened by months of bombing and the collapse of their government, is left in a state of shock and confusion. Many civilians attempt to flee to the countryside, but the Nazi forces, anticipating this, have already set up checkpoints and roadblocks, making escape virtually impossible. Those who remain are subjected to constant surveillance, and any signs of rebellion or resistance are swiftly crushed. The Nazi regime immediately sets about reshaping the country to fit its needs. British industries are repurposed to serve the German war effort, with factories now producing weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies. Food and resources are requisitioned to feed the occupying forces, and rations for the local population are severely limited. The German authorities implement strict controls on transportation, limiting movement within the country and ensuring that the population remains under constant watch. The British people are also subjected to Nazi propaganda, which seeks to break their spirit and indoctrinate them into the new order. The Nazis used the media, schools, and public events to portray themselves as the rightful rulers of Britain, claiming that their occupation is for the benefit of the British people. British cultural symbols are suppressed, and German language and customs are introduced in an attempt to erase the nation's identity. The resistance, though heavily suppressed, is not entirely gone. Underground networks of British civilians, disillusioned soldiers, and former members of the British government begin to organize in secret, plotting ways to undermine the Nazi occupation. Sabotage, espionage, and covert operations become the tools of those who refuse to accept Nazi rule. The occupation of Britain, though brutal, is far from final. The country may be under German control, but the spirit of resistance and the hope for a future liberation continue to burn in the hearts of many. The question remains, how long can the Nazis hold Britain, and will a new generation of leaders rise to restore the country's freedom? The Nazi administration in London. With the fall of Britain and the surrender of its government, the Nazis establish a firm administrative presence in London, cementing their control over the capital. The city, once a symbol of British power and resilience, now serves as the heart of Nazi rule in occupied Britain. The German authorities quickly set up their headquarters in Whitehall, transforming government buildings into a base of operations for the Reich. Berlin's influence in the heart of London becomes a daily reminder of the nation's new reality under occupation. The head of the Nazi administration in London is a high-ranking officer, typically a senior member of the SS or Wehrmacht, appointed to oversee the occupation and enforce German policies. This figure is not only a military leader, but also a political representative of Hitler's regime, responsible for implementing the broader goals of the Third Reich. The Nazi administration works closely with local British collaborators, including traitorous political figures, business leaders, and aristocrats who have chosen to cooperate with their occupiers, either for personal gain or out of ideological alignment. These collaborators assist in managing the day-to-day running of the country, implementing Nazi laws, and ensuring the population submits to their new rulers. One of the first tasks of the Nazi administration is to establish control over key institutions. The British Parliament is dissolved, and a puppet government is set up to maintain a semblance of order under German guidance. The British royal family's exile to North America leaves a power vacuum that the Nazis quickly fill, installing a pro-German monarchy or a figurehead to serve as a symbol of British compliance. At the same time, the local police forces are either integrated into the German military or purged, replaced by loyalists and Nazi operatives who enforce German rule. The German occupation brings with it an extreme surveillance state. The Gestapo, along with newly established Nazi intelligence networks, monitor all forms of communication, social gatherings, and public movements. The population is required to report any suspicious activity, and all forms of dissent are crushed with extreme severity. Political prisoners, intellectuals, and those suspected of harboring anti-Nazi sentiments are rounded up and either sent to concentration camps or executed. The Nazi administration also works tirelessly to restructure British society to align with Nazi ideology. Cultural institutions, schools, and universities are reprogrammed to promote Nazi ideals with a focus on glorifying the Aryan race and erasing any remnants of British nationalism. The arts, media, and entertainment industries are co-opted into spreading pro-German propaganda, while censorship silences any form of resistance. While the German administration seeks to consolidate its rule over London and the rest of Britain, the occupation is not without its tensions. Underground resistance movements continue to operate, and the occupation's brutality only fuels the fire of defiance in the hearts of many Britons. The Nazis may control the streets and the institutions, but the spirit of resistance is never fully extinguished. Resistance movements and underground fighters. Despite the overwhelming power of the Nazi occupation, resistance movements begin to take shape across Britain. These groups, made up of ordinary citizens, former soldiers, and disillusioned civilians, are united by a single goal: to fight back against the oppressive rule of Nazi Germany. Operating mostly in the shadows, these underground fighters wage a silent war of sabotage, espionage, and subversion, determined to keep alive the flame of British defiance. The resistance operates in a variety of ways. Some groups focus on sabotage, targeting key German military installations, supply lines, and communication networks. They damage railways, blow up ammunition depots, and disrupt the flow of German resources, making the occupation more difficult to sustain. These actions, though small in scale, have a cumulative effect, disrupting the efficiency of the Nazi war machine. The resistance also targets collaborators, British citizens who have sold out their country and are assisting the Germans. Spying, covert assassinations, and blackmail campaigns become common tactics used by these underground fighters to eliminate traitors and discourage others from aligning with the occupiers. Another key component of the resistance is the underground press. In defiance of the German censorship, clandestine newspapers and pamphlets begin circulating throughout occupied Britain. These publications keep the spirit of resistance alive, offering news from abroad, providing updates on the war, and calling for continued defiance against the Nazi occupiers. They also serve as a beacon of hope for the British population, reminding them that not all is lost and that the fight for freedom is far from over. The resistance movements are not without their challenges. The Nazis, aware of the growing threat, implement draconian measures to root out insurgents. The Gestapo and SS units become increasingly ruthless, using terror and torture to extract information from suspected resistance members. Whole neighborhoods are rounded up, and hostages are taken to punish those who dare oppose the occupation. Yet, despite the constant threat of violence, the underground fighters persist, often relying on a complex network of safe houses, codes, and clandestine meetings to carry out their operations. One of the most significant achievements of the resistance is the coordination with Allied forces. As the war rages on, British underground fighters establish communication with the Allies, providing vital intelligence about German troop movements, supply depots, and fortifications. These intelligence networks play a crucial role in laying the groundwork for future liberation efforts, and their contributions help to pave the way for a potential Allied invasion or airstrikes against key German targets. The resistance may be fragmented, and their efforts may appear small in the grand scheme of the occupation, but their courage and persistence represent the indomitable will of a people unwilling to accept Nazi rule. Even in the darkest of times, the underground fighters keep the hope of liberation alive, proving that, though Britain may have fallen, the spirit of resistance can never truly be extinguished. Daily life under German rule. Life in Britain under German occupation is a daily struggle for survival, as the Nazi regime imposes its will on every facet of British society. The once bustling cities are now filled with German soldiers, military vehicles, and the omnipresent swastika, a constant reminder that the British people are under foreign rule. The occupation fundamentally alters the daily routines of ordinary citizens who must learn to navigate a life of repression, fear, and scarcity. For many, the most immediate impact of German rule is the curtailing of freedoms. The occupying forces enforce strict curfews, and the movement of civilians is tightly controlled. Public gatherings are banned, and any sign of rebellion is met with swift and brutal punishment. The Gestapo runs an extensive network of informants, and every aspect of life is surveilled. People must be constantly wary of what they say and whom they trust, as betraying even the smallest hint of dissent can lead to arrest or worse. The German authorities implement rationing as they requisition resources for the war effort. Food becomes scarce, and many British citizens find themselves struggling to feed their families. Supermarkets are stripped bare, and black markets emerge as a way for some to obtain the necessities of life, though at a high cost. The once thriving British economy is now a shadow of its former self, as factories and industries are repurposed to support the needs of the German military. The working class faces especially harsh conditions, with long hours, low wages, and little hope of improvement. Cultural and social life in occupied Britain is dramatically reshaped. The Nazis push for the Germanization of British culture, introducing their own education system, replacing English textbooks with those that promote Nazi ideology, and attempting to erase any remnants of British identity. Public celebrations, holidays, and even symbols of British heritage are suppressed. The once celebrated British institutions, such as the BBC, are replaced with Nazi propaganda, and any media critical of the regime is censored or shut down. Yet, amid the daily hardships, the spirit of resistance endures. In hidden corners of society, people continue to gather in secret to share news from abroad, discuss the war, and plan acts of defiance. Many who have lost loved ones or been personally affected by the occupation still refuse to yield to the Nazi overlords. The underground press continues to circulate, offering news of the war and the efforts of Allied forces, providing a glimmer of hope for the future. Daily life under German rule is one of constant fear, deprivation, and subjugation, yet the resilience of the British people remains unbroken. They may live in a world of occupation, but the hope of eventual liberation burns quietly within them, and the memory of a free Britain is never far from their minds. Chapter 7. The Fate of the British Empire. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany sends shockwaves throughout the British Empire. The once vast network of colonies and dominions that spanned across the globe. With the heart of the empire now under foreign occupation, the future of its far-flung territories hangs in the balance. The German victory in Britain has far-reaching consequences, both for the British people and for the imperial territories that have long been the foundation of British power and influence. At first, the immediate impact on the colonies is one of uncertainty. News of Britain's surrender spreads quickly through the empire, sparking fear and confusion in many regions. For some colonies, particularly those in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the fall of Britain represents a dramatic shift in the global balance of power. The collapse of British authority opens the door for other nations, including Germany and Japan, to expand their influence. In some regions, there is a rise in nationalist movements as colonial leaders see the weakness of their former masters as an opportunity to push for independence or greater autonomy. In parts of the empire with strategic value, such as India, Egypt, and the Middle East, the Germans begin to exert influence. Nazi diplomats and military officers are dispatched to negotiate with local leaders, offering promises of support in exchange for allegiance to the Axis powers. While many colonial leaders are hesitant to align with the Nazis, the reality of British weakness leaves them with little choice. In some cases, the Axis powers succeed in gaining the cooperation of local rulers, further eroding British authority. However, not all territories fall under Axis control. The United States, having remained neutral during much of the early stages of the war, continues to support the British Empire in its remaining strongholds, particularly in the Pacific. British dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, though weakened by Britain's defeat, continue to fight alongside the Allies in the hope of one day liberating their homeland from Nazi rule. These nations, while not able to reclaim Britain immediately, serve as a vital source of support and resistance in the global struggle against the Axis powers. The fall of Britain also leads to a fundamental rethinking of the British Empire's future. With the loss of the home islands, many within the empire begin to question the viability of imperialism in the modern world. The war and Britain's fall to the Nazis accelerates movements toward decolonization, as subject nations increasingly demand self-rule. The days of the British Empire, once so dominant, are numbered. Though Britain's empire may be in decline, the fate of its people and its territories remains uncertain. The once mighty colonial system is crumbling, and the world is changing in ways that even the Nazis could not have foreseen. In the shadow of occupation, the British Empire begins its slow but inevitable unraveling. The effect on the dominions, Canada, Australia, and India. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany has a profound impact on the British dominions, Canada, Australia, and India, each of which responds to the crisis in its own way. These nations, once loyal and integral members of the British Empire, must now navigate a world where their former colonial motherland has been conquered, and the balance of global power has been irrevocably shifted. Canada, located far from the conflict, but still deeply tied to Britain, faces immediate uncertainty. The defeat of Britain leads to a crisis of national identity as Canadians grapple with their loyalty to the British Crown and the new realities of the post-war world. The country's leadership, while initially shocked by Britain's collapse, begins to take a more independent path, though the trauma of the occupation and the loss of Britain as a protector hangs heavily over the nation. Canadian forces, although spread thin, continue to fight alongside the Allies, committing to resistance efforts and supporting any potential future liberation of Britain. Public opinion in Canada begins to shift, with a growing sentiment for national sovereignty and less reliance on the British Empire. Canada's political landscape starts to evolve toward a more self-determined future, though it remains closely tied to Britain's cause in the immediate aftermath. Australia, similarly, faces a crisis of confidence in its ties to Britain. While Australians initially hold out hope that the fall of Britain might be temporary, the reality of Nazi control forces the country to reckon with its future. The Australian government, led by Prime Minister Robert Menzies, struggles to maintain a semblance of stability and continues to support the Allied cause, even after Britain's surrender. Australian forces remain committed to the Pacific Theater, fighting against Japanese expansion as the war spreads to the east. However, there is an increasing shift in Australian sentiment with a greater desire for autonomy and security. The war efforts begin to push Australia into a closer relationship with the United States, signaling the early seeds of an eventual shift away from the British Empire toward a more independent and Pacific-oriented outlook. India's situation is drastically different. The British occupation of Britain has a profound psychological and political effect on the Indian subcontinent. For decades, India has struggled for independence, and the collapse of the British Empire strengthens the resolve of nationalist leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose. The loss of Britain's power sends ripples throughout India, with both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League seizing the moment to demand independence. The power vacuum left by Britain's fall leads to growing unrest, and India becomes increasingly difficult for the German-backed puppet government to control. German influence attempts to woo Indian nationalists with promises of self-rule, but the Indian people, driven by the desire for independence, are divided over the prospect of aligning with Nazi Germany. As the pressure for decolonization grows, India inches closer to independence, with Britain's collapse accelerating the end of its colonial rule in the region. The fall of Britain leaves its dominions in a state of flux, but one thing is clear: the era of the British Empire is coming to an end, and the dominions are beginning to chart their own destinies, freed from the constraints of imperial dependence. The German-Japanese alliance and the Pacific. With Britain's collapse and the Axis powers solidifying their control over much of Europe, the German-Japanese alliance strengthens and shifts the global power dynamics, particularly in the Pacific region. Japan, already a formidable military power in East Asia, sees the fall of Britain as an opportunity to expand its influence throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Germans, on the other hand, are keen to exploit Japan's position to weaken any remaining resistance from the Allies, particularly the United States, which has maintained a tenuous hold over the Pacific. The Nazi regime, although focused primarily on Europe, recognizes the value of its alliance with Japan in reshaping the balance of power. With Britain effectively neutralized and the United States still grappling with its own internal political and military strategy, the German-Japanese alliance becomes a key element in the Axis' broader vision of global dominance. Germany provides Japan with military intelligence and technological support, including advanced weaponry and naval tactics, while Japan's strategic positioning in the Pacific opens the door for German influence to spread into the region. For Japan, the collapse of Britain brings immediate gains. With little to stop them, Japanese forces move swiftly to seize former British colonies in Asia, including Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya, further bolstering their control over the Pacific. This expansion accelerates Japan's ambitions to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a bloc of nations under Japanese hegemony. The Pacific becomes a key theater for the Axis powers, with Germany providing logistical and strategic support to Japan's military campaigns. Together, they coordinate naval operations, share resources, and exchange intelligence, solidifying their position as dominant powers in the region. The United States, despite its neutral stance in the early stages of the war, recognizes the growing threat posed by the German-Japanese alliance. As Japan moves to consolidate its empire, the U.S. is drawn into a conflict with Japan, culminating in a full-scale war in the Pacific. However, with Britain out of the picture, the U.S. wing finds itself fighting a much more difficult and complex war, now facing not only Japan, but also the growing threat of German-backed naval forces in the region. The German-Japanese alliance shifts the Pacific theater into a more complex and multifaceted struggle. The combined Axis forces bring new challenges to the U.S. and the remaining Allied nations. The collapse of Britain has effectively handed the Axis a significant advantage in the Pacific, where their reach and influence expand rapidly, forcing the Allies to rethink their strategies and mobilize for a prolonged and increasingly difficult war in both the Pacific and European theaters. The United States' reaction to Britain's fall. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany sends shockwaves through the global political landscape, and the United States, once an isolated power, finds itself confronting an unprecedented crisis. Britain, the traditional pillar of Western democracy, has now been occupied by the Nazis, leaving the United States with a looming question. How should it respond to the collapse of its closest ally and the shifting balance of power? Initially, the U.S. government, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, struggles to reconcile the isolationist sentiment still prevalent among the American public with the need to confront the Axis threat. The United States had long maintained a policy of non-intervention, driven in part by a desire to avoid getting entangled in the conflicts that had plagued Europe. However, the fall of Britain shatters the illusion of security. With the British Isles under Nazi control, the Atlantic Ocean no longer serves as a natural buffer, and the threat to American shores feels imminent. The United States' initial response is one of shock and disbelief, followed by cautious support for any remnants of resistance to the Axis powers. Roosevelt, in particular, faces immense pressure from both the public and the military establishment to take a more active role in the fight. The president begins to shift U.S. foreign policy, offering more direct support to the remaining Allied forces, particularly in the Pacific and North Africa. The United States supplies arms, resources, and military aid to countries still resisting the Axis, including France, the Soviet Union, and the dominions like Canada and Australia. This assistance, however, is tempered by a reluctance to commit U.S. forces to combat, as many Americans still believe that direct military intervention is a step too far. The Pacific theater becomes the focal point of U.S. military strategy. With Britain out of the picture, the United States begins to accelerate its military buildup in the Pacific, preparing for an inevitable confrontation with Japan. The Japanese, emboldened by Britain's fall, expand their territorial ambitions throughout Southeast Asia, and the U.S. finds itself increasingly drawn into the conflict. The growing threat in the Pacific, combined with the Nazi occupation of Britain, forces the United States to reconsider its previous stance on isolationism. Public opinion in the U.S. slowly shifts as the gravity of the situation becomes clearer. The American people, once wary of getting involved in another European conflict, now recognize that the survival of democracy itself is at stake. In this new world order, the United States, once a neutral bystander, is now on the front lines of the battle against tyranny, with Britain's fall marking the beginning of a more direct and decisive involvement in the global struggle against the Axis powers. Chapter 8: Hitler's New Europe. With Britain's fall and the Axis powers consolidating their control over much of Europe, Adolf Hitler begins to shape his vision for a new European order. The defeat of the United Kingdom represents the pinnacle of Nazi Germany's ambitions in Europe, and Hitler is now free to implement his grand plan for a continent dominated by Nazi ideology, totalitarian control, and the expansion of the German Empire. This new Europe is one built on the principles of racial hierarchy, brutal occupation, and the suppression of any opposition to the Nazi regime. At the heart of Hitler's vision is the creation of a Greater German Reich, which encompasses not only Germany but also large swathes of the conquered territories. These areas are to be reorganized to serve the needs of the German state and the Aryan race. The former countries of Western and Eastern Europe are subjected to harsh military and political control, with their economies turned toward supplying the Nazi war machine. The German language becomes the dominant language in education, government, and business, while any local identities or cultures are systematically suppressed. One of the most sinister aspects of Hitler's New Europe is the policy of ethnic cleansing and genocide. The Nazis view many of the populations in occupied territories, particularly Jews, Romani people, and Slavs, as racially inferior. In countries like Poland and Ukraine, the Nazis embark on a campaign of extermination, pushing their policies of mass murder and forced labor to unprecedented levels. The infamous Holocaust, which saw the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, becomes a central part of Hitler's vision for Europe. Concentration camps and death camps are set up across the continent, and millions of innocents are sent to their deaths in an industrialized slaughter. At the same time, Hitler works to integrate the elites of the occupied countries into the Nazi system. Many leaders and aristocrats are co-opted or intimidated into cooperating with the Germans, while those who resist are swiftly eliminated. In some regions, puppet governments are installed, loyal to the Nazis, and the local population is kept in line through fear, repression, and the presence of brutal German military forces. However, not all of Europe accepts Nazi rule. In many countries, underground resistance movements emerge, fueled by the desire to overthrow the occupation and restore national sovereignty. These movements, although fractured and often poorly coordinated, represent a constant thorn in the side of the Nazi regime, and they contribute to the growing instability in Europe. Despite the overwhelming power of Nazi Germany, the reality of controlling an entire continent under totalitarian rule proves to be far more challenging than Hitler had anticipated. Hitler's New Europe, though founded on the ideals of Nazi racial purity and authoritarian control, is a continent marked by fear, oppression, and bloodshed. The world outside of Nazi Europe begins to look for ways to resist, and the embers of rebellion are already beginning to smolder beneath the surface. The reshaping of the British Isles. Following the fall of Britain to Nazi Germany, the British Isles undergo a profound transformation under German occupation. The once proud and independent nation of Britain is now subject to the will of the Third Reich, and the reshaping of its political, social, and economic landscape begins almost immediately. The British Isles, which had long served as a symbol of resistance against tyranny, now become a key strategic territory in the German Empire, and its inhabitants are thrust into an oppressive new reality. The first major change is the dismantling of Britain's existing government and institutions. Winston Churchill's government is toppled, and a puppet regime is established under German control. The Nazi leadership installs a collaborationist government, which, while not directly controlled by Berlin, is heavily influenced and coerced into aligning with Nazi policies. The British monarchy, once a symbol of national unity, is rendered largely powerless, with the royal family forced into exile or captivity. King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and their children are taken to Germany, where they are used as pawns in Nazi propaganda, paraded before the German people as a symbol of victory. The social fabric of the British Isles is also torn apart. Resistance to the occupation is quickly crushed, and Nazi policies of surveillance, censorship, and repression are swiftly put in place. German military forces patrol the streets, and the British people are subjected to curfews, rationing, and forced labor. In cities like London, which had once been the heart of the British Empire, a once vibrant urban environment now becomes a grim symbol of Nazi control. Historic buildings are repurposed for German use, and the population is kept in line by the Gestapo, who ruthlessly root out any signs of rebellion or dissent. Economically, the British Isles are fully integrated into the Nazi war machine. Factories that once produced British goods are now converted to manufacture military equipment for the Nazis. The once thriving British economy is restructured to serve the needs of the German Empire, with agricultural output redirected to feed German soldiers and workers. The British people, who once enjoyed a relatively high standard of living, now live in a state of poverty and deprivation, as most resources are siphoned off to sustain the German war effort. Culturally, the British Isles undergo a painful erasure of its national identity. The German language is enforced in schools, and British history is rewritten to fit the Nazi narrative. Symbols of British pride, such as the Union Jack and national monuments, are replaced with Nazi insignia and propaganda. Attempts to maintain British traditions and culture are met with harsh repression, and any expression of defiance is crushed by the Gestapo. Yet even under this oppressive regime, pockets of resistance continue to emerge throughout the British Isles. Underground movements, fueled by the desire to reclaim national sovereignty and rid their homeland of the Nazi yoke, work tirelessly to undermine the occupiers. These resistance efforts, although often small and fragmented, become a source of hope for the British people and lay the groundwork for future efforts to liberate the nation. Despite the profound reshaping of the British Isles, the spirit of resistance remains alive, waiting for the day when Britain will rise once again. Germanization and collaboration. Following the fall of Britain, Nazi Germany implements a systematic policy of Germanization across the occupied territories, including the British Isles. The goal of this policy is not only to exert control, but also to reshape the very identity of the British people, integrating them into the Nazi vision of a greater German Reich. This process involves both forced collaboration with Nazi authorities and the active suppression of any remaining national identity. Germanization begins with the installation of Nazi-friendly collaborators in key political positions. People who are willing to work with the occupiers for their own benefit or under duress. These individuals, often members of the British aristocracy or political elites, form puppet governments that serve Nazi interests. They enact policies that facilitate the occupation, often at the expense of their own people. Collaboration becomes a means of survival for many, as those who cooperate with the Nazis are granted privileges, while those who resist or dissent face swift and brutal punishment. The social impact of Germanization is profound. Nazi authorities work to reorient British society toward their ideals, forcing the population to adopt German customs, language, and culture. The German language is promoted in schools and public life, with English increasingly marginalized. The British education system is overhauled to teach Nazi ideals, including the concept of Aryan superiority and the justification for the Nazi conquest of Europe. Cultural institutions, such as the arts and media, are co-opted to produce propaganda that glorifies the Nazi regime and demonizes the Allies. British literature and history are rewritten, and symbols of British identity are replaced by those of Nazi Germany. Collaborators are not limited to the British elites. As the occupation continues, ordinary British citizens are forced to choose sides. Some, particularly in the early stages of occupation, view collaboration as a pragmatic choice to avoid the hardships of resistance. Others become ideologically aligned with Nazi ideals, particularly those who resent British democracy and imperialism. These collaborators work alongside the German military, reporting on suspected subversives, maintaining the flow of resources to the Nazis, and even participating in the repression of resistance movements. However, not everyone in Britain succumbs to the pressure to collaborate. Resistance movements, composed of both civilians and former British soldiers, form across the Isles. These groups work to sabotage Nazi infrastructure, spread underground propaganda, and coordinate with the remnants of the British government in exile. While they are small and fragmented, the resistance efforts pose a persistent challenge to German authority and contribute to the continued tension in the occupied British Isles. Ultimately, the success of Germanization and collaboration in Britain is incomplete. Although Nazi policies reshape much of British society, the spirit of resistance remains strong, and many continue to resist the attempt to erase their national identity. The occupation is a dark chapter in British history, but it also proves that the will to preserve one's culture and sovereignty can survive even in the most oppressive of circumstances. Britain's role in Nazi global strategy. With Britain's fall to Nazi Germany, the strategic importance of the British Isles undergoes a dramatic transformation within the broader framework of Nazi global ambitions. Adolf Hitler's vision for a new world order includes not just the domination of Europe, but the expansion of Nazi influence on a global scale. The British Isles, once a key player in the global balance of power, are now an integral part of the Nazi Empire, providing crucial military, economic, and geopolitical leverage in Hitler's quest for world domination. Britain's role in Nazi global strategy is multifaceted. First and foremost, the British Isles are a vital geographic asset in securing German control over Western Europe and the Atlantic. The defeat of Britain effectively clears the way for German control of Europe's western coastline, giving the Nazis unprecedented control over the Mediterranean and access to critical shipping routes. In this context, Britain's strategic location becomes a launching pad for Nazi expansion, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, where access to natural resources such as oil and minerals is a key objective. Furthermore, the fall of Britain solidifies Nazi dominance over the European continent. With the British Empire out of the picture, the Nazis can consolidate their hold over much of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The British colonial system, once a bulwark against German expansion, is now under Nazi influence, with key territories in the British Empire being either directly annexed or placed under Nazi control. This allows Germany to tap into the vast resources of the former British colonies, expanding its economic and military reach. Additionally, Nazi Germany uses Britain's collapse as a strategic tool in its relationship with Japan. With Britain out of the picture, the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, can now coordinate their efforts to secure dominance over the Pacific and Asia. The German-Japanese alliance, bolstered by the defeat of Britain, allows the two nations to create a more unified front in their war against the United States and the Soviet Union. Japan, with its growing influence in Asia, can now operate with the full backing of the German war machine, creating a formidable Axis partnership that challenges any remaining resistance from the Allies. Britain's defeat also has a psychological effect on global politics. The fall of such a powerful and historically dominant nation sends shockwaves across the world, signaling to other nations that resistance to Nazi power is futile. The collapse of the British Empire accelerates the weakening of other European powers, such as France and the Netherlands, which are either directly conquered or fall under Nazi control. In summary, Britain's role in Nazi global strategy shifts dramatically after its fall. The British Isles serve as a critical component in the Nazis' broader objectives of economic expansion, military dominance, and geopolitical control. Though Britain's defeat initially seems like a victory for Nazi Germany, the larger consequences of the occupation prove that even in its darkest hour, Britain's influence on the world stage continues to reverberate. Chapter 9: The Soviet Union and the Eastern Front. After the fall of Britain, Nazi Germany shifts its focus to the Eastern Front, aiming to extend its control over the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. Hitler's long-held ambitions for Lebensraum, or living space, drive his desire to conquer the resource-rich lands of the Soviet East. However, the collapse of Britain changes the strategic landscape, allowing Nazi forces to redirect their full attention and military might toward the East. In this alternate history, the defeat of Britain has profound effects on the balance of power between Germany and the Soviet Union. With the British threat neutralized, Germany can now focus entirely on the Soviet Union, accelerating the timeline for Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that had been delayed in history. The full weight of the Wehrmacht, backed by resources from Britain and the newly acquired territories, is thrown into the Eastern Front. The initial success of this offensive is overwhelming, with Soviet forces caught off guard by the sheer scale and speed of the German assault. One of the critical advantages that Germany gains in this alternate timeline is the ability to cut off Soviet supply lines from the British Empire, particularly in the Middle East and India. The loss of Britain means the Soviets no longer have the same access to resources and supplies, weakening their ability to resist the German onslaught. Additionally, without the threat of Allied intervention in Europe, Germany can focus its resources on the Eastern Front without worrying about a Western Front or a second front opening in North Africa. The impact of these changes is devastating for the Soviet Union. Stalin, already paranoid and mistrustful of his generals, struggles to coordinate an effective response to the German advance. The Red Army, initially unprepared for the scale of the German attack, faces rapid losses. Key cities such as Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad fall quickly, and the Soviet Union finds itself in a defensive position, unable to mount a counteroffensive due to the depletion of its military resources and manpower. However, despite the initial success of the German invasion, the vast distances of the Soviet Union and the brutal winters prove to be formidable obstacles for the Wehrmacht. In this alternate timeline, the Germans are able to advance much further before the weather and terrain begin to slow them down. The lack of British involvement in the war allows Germany to consolidate its gains more effectively and establish a stronger foothold in Soviet territory. The fall of Britain also affects the global dynamic, as the United States, now isolated and left to face the Axis powers without its traditional allies, is forced to reconsider its role in the war. The Soviet Union, weakened and isolated, faces a dire situation as the full force of Nazi Germany bears down on it, reshaping the entire Eastern Front and the fate of the Soviet Union itself. The Nazi conquest of the East becomes a defining feature of the Axis powers' global strategy. Germany's strengthened position for Operation Barbarossa. The successful defeat of Britain dramatically alters the strategic landscape for Nazi Germany, providing them with a strengthened position for launching Operation Barbarossa, the long-awaited invasion of the Soviet Union. With Britain neutralized, the Nazis no longer have to worry about a Western Front or the distractions posed by the British Isles and their colonies. This newfound freedom allows Germany to consolidate its military and economic resources, preparing for a focused and overwhelming assault on the Soviet Union. One of the primary advantages Germany gains is the ability to redirect vast amounts of resources from Britain's former territories. The annexation of British territories across the globe provides Germany with access to key resources, including oil from the Middle East, food supplies from Africa, and valuable minerals. These resources fuel the Nazi war machine, ensuring that Germany has the logistical capacity to sustain a prolonged military campaign in the East. Additionally, the capture of British naval assets strengthens Germany's ability to control the seas, reducing the risk of British interference and facilitating the secure transportation of supplies to the front lines. With Britain no longer posing a threat, the Luftwaffe is also able to fully focus on supporting the invasion of the Soviet Union. The air superiority that Germany achieves over Britain now extends to the Eastern Front, where Luftwaffe forces can conduct relentless bombing campaigns against Soviet infrastructure, supply lines, and military targets. This air dominance disrupts Soviet military operations and weakens their ability to defend key strategic locations, including major cities such as Leningrad and Moscow. The absence of British forces also prevents the Soviets from receiving the same level of support they historically received from the West, further isolating them in the face of the Nazi onslaught. Germany's military position is further strengthened by the ideological shift within the Soviet Union. With the British Empire gone, the Soviet leadership faces internal divisions and a crisis of morale. Stalin's paranoia and oppressive regime weakened Soviet unity, creating opportunities for Nazi forces to exploit divisions within the Red Army and the civilian population. While the Soviet Union is still a formidable adversary, the disarray within its leadership and the draining of resources from the loss of external support make it more vulnerable to the full force of the German invasion. In this alternate timeline, the combination of military readiness, economic resources, and internal Soviet weaknesses provides Germany with a unique opportunity to launch a successful Operation Barbarossa. With no Allied forces to divert their attention or drain their resources, Nazi Germany is in a position to strike with full force, shifting the balance of power in Europe and reshaping the future of the Eastern Front. The momentum of the invasion, bolstered by Britain's fall, tips the scales in Germany's favor, bringing them closer than ever to achieving their long-term objectives in the Soviet Union. Stalin's response to a Nazi-dominated Europe. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany sends shockwaves through the Soviet Union, altering the geopolitical landscape of Europe in ways Stalin had never anticipated. As the Axis powers grow in strength and Britain is absorbed into the Nazi empire, Stalin is left grappling with the realities of a Nazi-dominated continent. The loss of Britain, once seen as the last major obstacle to German hegemony, now places the Soviet Union in a precarious position, surrounded by hostile powers intent on reshaping Europe in their image. Stalin's first response is a mixture of disbelief and paranoia. The unexpected turn of events forces him to confront the possibility that Germany could now focus its military might entirely on the Soviet Union, bypassing any further distraction from the West. His initial calculations, based on the assumption that Britain could hold out long enough to counterbalance German power, no longer hold water. With no Allied forces operating in Europe and the British military neutralized, Stalin sees himself as the last barrier between the Nazi war machine and complete domination of the continent. In response, Stalin begins to fortify the Soviet Union's defenses, pushing for rapid industrialization and military expansion in anticipation of a German invasion. The Soviet military, which had already suffered from purges in the late 1930s, is thrown into a state of urgent readiness. Soviet troops are moved to strategic locations along the western border, and defensive fortifications are reinforced. However, Stalin's paranoia still hinders his decision-making, as he distrusts many of his senior military officers and struggles with internal power struggles within the Kremlin. The delay in preparing for the inevitable German onslaught creates a significant disadvantage for the Soviets, allowing Germany to make significant advances into Soviet territory with less resistance. In addition to military preparation, Stalin turns to diplomacy, trying to secure support from any remaining nations outside the Axis sphere. His primary focus shifts to the United States, hoping that American intervention might tilt the balance of power back in favor of the Allies. However, with Britain defeated and the Nazi war machine unchecked, the United States finds itself in a difficult position, isolated and unsure of how to respond. Stalin's efforts to form new alliances are met with limited success, leaving the Soviet Union largely isolated in the face of the German threat. Despite these efforts, Stalin is ultimately forced to confront the grim reality that the Soviet Union is now surrounded by Axis powers and lacks the resources or alliances to mount an immediate counteroffensive. With Nazi Germany positioned as the dominant force in Europe, the Soviet Union enters a tense, defensive phase, struggling to hold its ground while awaiting an opportunity to strike back. The loss of Britain has irrevocably altered the balance of power in Europe, and Stalin must now face the harsh consequences of a Nazi-dominated continent. The fate of the Eastern War. In this alternate timeline where Nazi Germany has successfully subdued Britain, the course of the Eastern War takes a drastically different direction. Operation Barbarossa, launched in the summer of 1941, faces no interference from the West, allowing the Wehrmacht to focus all of its resources on the Soviet Union. The absence of British resistance, as well as the lack of any Allied forces in Europe, grants Hitler a strategic advantage unlike anything he historically enjoyed. This changes the balance of power on the Eastern Front, tilting the war in favor of Nazi Germany from the start. The Luftwaffe, which would have been engaged in a prolonged struggle over Britain, now gains uncontested air superiority in the east. This means that German bombers can ravage Soviet supply lines, communications, and infrastructure with little opposition. The Soviet Air Force, already stretched thin and poorly equipped, is quickly overwhelmed, and Germany's air dominance allows for faster and more efficient troop movements on the ground. The German forces can make quicker advances into Soviet territory, capturing key cities like Leningrad and Moscow before the Red Army can effectively mobilize. The lack of British support for the Soviet Union leaves Stalin with limited options. The Soviets, already weakened by internal purges and unprepared for such a swift German onslaught, struggle to mount a coherent defense. The Red Army, spread thin across the vast Soviet landscape, cannot concentrate enough forces in key locations. Hitler's tactics of encirclement and blitzkrieg cause massive casualties and disarray among Soviet forces. Cities fall rapidly, and while the Soviets attempt to retreat, the loss of vital territory severely hampers their ability to regroup. Without the possibility of Allied intervention, the Soviet Union becomes isolated. The United States, while still neutral, is far removed from the European theater and is not yet fully mobilized to counter the Axis threat. Stalin's hopes for external support from Britain or any other ally vanish, leaving him with no option but to rely on the dwindling resources of his own country. As 1942 progresses, the German advance into the Soviet heartland becomes nearly unstoppable. The Wehrmacht, having captured key industrial regions and oil fields, gains a vital resource base that sustains its operations. With little external help and no realistic hope of defeating the German juggernaut, the Soviet Union begins to collapse under the pressure. Stalin's grip on power weakens, and the once formidable Red Army is shattered. By mid-1943, Nazi Germany has achieved its objectives in the East, and the Soviet Union, crippled and divided, faces an uncertain future under Nazi dominance. The Eastern War ends not with a Soviet victory, but with the complete triumph of the Axis powers. Chapter 10: The United States, Isolation or Intervention. As Nazi Germany consolidates its power over Britain and the Soviet Union, the question of American involvement in the war becomes ever more critical. In this alternate timeline, with Europe falling under Axis control, the United States faces an unprecedented dilemma: to remain isolated or to intervene in a European conflict that has now reshaped the global order. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, having initially pursued policies of neutrality, finds himself at a crossroads where the looming specter of Nazi dominance could either prompt the U.S. into action or leave the nation to watch from the sidelines as the world transforms. In the early stages of the conflict, public opinion in the United States remains staunchly isolationist. The horrors of the Great Depression, followed by the recent events in Europe, leave many Americans wary of entangling themselves in another overseas war. The American public, having witnessed the devastation of the First World War, is deeply divided on whether intervention is necessary. The memory of the war to end all wars still looms large, and the idea of entering another global conflict is unappealing to the majority. However, the increasing dominance of Nazi Germany shifts the global balance of power. With Britain defeated and the Soviet Union in retreat, Germany's unchecked aggression begins to stir concerns in Washington. The United States finds itself in a delicate position, facing growing pressure from both the Axis powers and the mounting realization that the European continent is now a Nazi stronghold. This raises the possibility of a direct threat to American interests, particularly as Germany's territorial ambitions reach beyond Europe. Hitler's rhetoric and territorial expansion may eventually put U.S. overseas territories and allies in the Pacific at risk. Roosevelt's position is increasingly difficult. While still committed to neutrality, he quietly begins to prepare for the eventuality of war. The United States increases its military preparedness, fortifying its defenses and providing some indirect support to countries resisting Axis domination. However, the notion of direct intervention remains controversial. Some advisors argue that America should bide its time, focusing on the defense of the Western Hemisphere and leaving Europe to resolve its own conflict. Others, recognizing the growing threat posed by Nazi control over the entire continent, push for a more active approach. By 1943, the question of American intervention becomes even more pressing. With Nazi Germany controlling much of Europe, the Axis powers set their sights on the Pacific, where Japan's ambitions are growing. The U.S. Navy is increasingly engaged in securing its Pacific territories, and the potential for a two-front war looms large. The attack on Pearl Harbor, whether a result of direct Axis collaboration or as a preemptive strike, becomes the catalyst for America's final decision. In a world where isolation has become increasingly impossible, the United States must confront the reality that it can no longer remain detached from the global conflict. The decision to intervene ultimately hinges on the threat posed to American interests, both at home and abroad. Roosevelt's dilemma: support or stand back? As Nazi Germany's dominance in Europe grows, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faces a difficult and unprecedented challenge. Having been a steadfast advocate for supporting the Allied cause, Roosevelt now must decide how to navigate a rapidly changing world where Britain has fallen and the Soviet Union teeters on the edge of collapse. The United States, still recovering from the effects of the Great Depression and embroiled in domestic challenges, has long adhered to a policy of isolationism. However, as the global balance shifts dramatically, Roosevelt must confront the critical question: should America step in to stop the Axis, or should it stay true to its non-interventionist principles and let Europe fight its own battles? Initially, Roosevelt's policy of neutrality was clear, driven by the American public's aversion to entering another foreign conflict. However, Roosevelt was not blind to the growing threat posed by Hitler's ambitions. The fall of France, the defeat of Britain, and the ongoing threats to the Soviet Union make Roosevelt increasingly uneasy. As the Axis powers' control of Europe becomes more absolute, Roosevelt is left with a moral and strategic dilemma. On one hand, America's geography and military power should shield it from the immediate dangers of Nazi control. On the other hand, Roosevelt knows that the longer the United States remains passive, the more difficult it will be to counter the growing power of Germany, which is already eyeing expansion beyond Europe. The situation becomes even more complicated with the escalating Japanese threat in the Pacific. As Japan aligns itself more closely with Germany, American interests in the Pacific are increasingly at risk. Roosevelt faces the painful reality that his administration must either take a stand against the Axis powers or risk watching the global order shift toward Nazi domination. His advisors, divided on the issue, offer no easy solutions. Some advocate for increasing indirect support to the remaining resistance movements in Europe, while others argue that a stronger, direct intervention could prevent a wider conflict before it spreads to the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt is caught between two competing visions. One, to stay out of the conflict and avoid the costs of war. And two, to fully commit to supporting the fight against the Axis, risking the lives of American soldiers and the future of the nation. As Roosevelt weighs his options, the pressures of public opinion, global instability, and the looming threat of war push him closer to a decision that will forever alter the course of history. The uncertainty of his choices represents one of the most defining moments in his presidency and in the history of World War II. American military and strategic adjustments. As the threat from Nazi Germany and its Axis allies grows, the United States finds itself compelled to adjust its military and strategic posture. With the collapse of Britain and the shifting balance of power in Europe, the prospect of war becomes ever more pressing. President Roosevelt, recognizing the inevitability of America's involvement, moves to strengthen the country's military capabilities and reevaluate its strategic priorities. These adjustments aim to both protect the United States' interests and prepare for potential involvement in a global conflict that now appears unavoidable. The first and most immediate shift occurs in the American military's readiness. For years, the U.S. had adhered to a policy of military non-intervention, with a focus on defense rather than offensive operations. However, with the rise of Nazi Germany and the growing threat in the Pacific, Roosevelt begins to expand the U.S. military significantly. The Army, Navy, and Air Force receive massive funding increases, and recruitment efforts are ramped up. The draft is reintroduced, drawing young men into the armed forces to ensure that the U.S. has the manpower to confront any emerging threats. Strategic defense spending also shifts from the limited peacetime measures of the 1930s to a wartime footing, as new weapons and technologies are developed to keep pace with the rapidly advancing military capabilities of the Axis powers. In terms of military strategy, the United States adopts a dual-focus approach. The first priority is the protection of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. moves to strengthen its defenses in the Caribbean and along its borders, fearing that Axis expansion into the Americas could be a very real possibility. The second focus is on preparations for a possible engagement in Europe, even as the United States remains officially neutral. Roosevelt orders the establishment of strategic alliances with any remaining European nations still resisting Axis control, including the Soviet Union, despite the ideological differences between the two powers. The U.S. also begins covertly supplying war materials to the Soviet Union, preparing for the possibility of opening a second front should the Axis push further eastward. Simultaneously, the United States ramps up its Pacific preparations. With Japan becoming more aligned with Germany, American officials recognize the need to fortify the Pacific and protect American territories. New naval bases are established in the Pacific Islands, and American forces begin to train for island-hopping tactics, anticipating future conflicts with Japan. These military and strategic adjustments are made with the understanding that the United States cannot remain a passive observer. The growing threat of Axis domination, both in Europe and the Pacific, demands that America modernize its military infrastructure and adopt a strategy of proactive engagement, even if direct intervention is still delayed. The foundation for future American involvement in World War II is laid as Roosevelt prepares the country for an inevitable war. The shift in the war's balance. With Britain's fall to Nazi Germany, the balance of power in the war shifts dramatically. The once dominant Allied forces find themselves severely weakened, while the Axis powers, led by Germany, gain unprecedented control over Europe. The consequences of this shift are felt globally, as nations now must reevaluate their positions and alliances in light of the Axis's growing strength. Nazi Germany's victory over Britain marks a pivotal turning point in the war. With the United Kingdom's surrender, Germany consolidates its control over Western Europe, positioning itself as the preeminent military power on the continent. The Wehrmacht's successful invasion of Britain, followed by the occupation of London and key strategic locations, demonstrates the effectiveness of their military might and war strategies. Germany's success solidifies its position as the dominant force in Europe, allowing Hitler to turn his attention toward further expansion, both to the east and west. With Britain no longer a viable counterbalance, the Axis powers, including Italy and Japan, are free to pursue their global ambitions unchallenged. This shift in the balance of power places the United States in a precarious position. Although the U.S. remains officially neutral, the collapse of Britain forces President Roosevelt to reconsider America's role in the conflict. The Axis powers' unchallenged dominance in Europe threatens to destabilize the global order, while Japan's growing influence in the Pacific poses a direct challenge to American interests. Roosevelt recognizes that the United States can no longer afford to stay on the sidelines, as the Axis success could have far-reaching consequences for the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union faces its own challenges. As Germany turns its attention eastward, Stalin is forced to confront the possibility of a two-front war. With Britain out of the picture, the Soviet Union becomes even more critical to the Allied cause. However, the Soviet response to Nazi Germany's advance remains uncertain, as Stalin grapples with the reality of being surrounded by hostile powers. This shift in the war's balance highlights the importance of alliances and the delicate balance of power that must be maintained to ensure victory. Overall, the fall of Britain marks a decisive shift in the war's balance, with the Axis powers enjoying a significant advantage. This new reality forces the remaining Allied nations, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, to reassess their strategies and adjust their military priorities in order to confront the Axis threat before it's too late. The war, once viewed as a distant European conflict, now becomes a global struggle for control of the world's future. Chapter 11. The Resistance Strikes Back. In the aftermath of Britain's fall to Nazi Germany, the world expects the Axis powers to solidify their control over Europe. However, they have underestimated the resilience of those who refuse to bow to the German occupation. Across occupied Britain and the broader territories of Europe, resistance movements begin to emerge, united by a common goal: to resist the German oppressors and undermine their stranglehold on the continent. The British resistance is one of the first to organize. Although London has fallen, the spirit of defiance remains alive in the hearts of many British citizens. Underground networks form, connecting various cells that work together to sabotage German operations, gather intelligence, and spread propaganda to keep the hope of liberation alive. These groups are made up of former military personnel, ordinary civilians, and even disillusioned members of the German occupation forces. The primary objective is to create chaos behind enemy lines, striking at strategic points to disrupt German supply lines, communication, and infrastructure. One of the most significant actions taken by the British resistance is the systematic sabotage of transportation and military targets. Railways, factories, and power plants become prime targets for sabotage. while key German officials are assassinated by operatives working in the shadows. Though the resistance's actions are often small in scale, they have a profound psychological impact. They send a message to the German occupiers. No matter how entrenched their power may seem, the people of Britain will never surrender. The resistance efforts spread to other parts of occupied Europe. In France, the Maquis, a group of rural guerrilla fighters, wage a relentless campaign against German forces. They ambush supply convoys, destroy railway tracks, and harass German patrols. In Belgium, Holland, and Norway, similar resistance movements form, each contributing to the growing tide of opposition against the Nazis. The German occupiers respond with increased repression, but the resistance fighters prove resilient, willing to endure harsh punishment and suffering in their quest for freedom. On the broader scale, these movements begin to have an impact on the strategic situation. The resistance efforts tie down German forces that would otherwise be deployed on the Eastern Front or in the Mediterranean. As the German occupation stretches thin, resources are diverted to deal with the growing insurgency. The acts of defiance by the resistance help to maintain the morale of the Allies and weaken the sense of invincibility the Nazis once held. As the war drags on, the resistance movements grow more organized, and their efforts play a crucial role in the eventual liberation of Europe. The work of these underground fighters proves that, even in the darkest of times, the flame of resistance cannot be extinguished. British partisans and secret rebel networks. In the wake of Nazi Germany's successful invasion and occupation of Britain, the idea of resistance takes root in the hearts of many who refuse to submit to foreign rule. While the official British military is shattered, and the government has either fallen or retreated into exile, a network of secret rebels and partisans emerges from the shadows. These groups, composed of soldiers, civilians, and intellectuals, form a hidden front against the occupiers, determined to strike back and weaken Germany's hold on the island. The British partisan movement operates in secrecy and is decentralized, making it difficult for German forces to fully eradicate the threat. A key feature of this movement is its reliance on small, tightly knit groups that operate in urban and rural areas alike. These groups often act independently, though they are linked by a common goal: the liberation of Britain from Nazi rule. Many partisans have no formal training, but are driven by a deep sense of patriotism and an unwavering belief in the possibility of victory. Partisan groups carry out sabotage missions against German infrastructure, targeting military supply lines, communication networks, and transportation hubs. Railways, crucial to the German war effort, become frequent targets of sabotage, with tracks blown up and trains ambushed. In cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, secret cells of partisans conduct guerrilla raids on German convoys and military installations. They strike quickly and fade into the population before the enemy can retaliate, using the urban environment to their advantage. Beyond physical sabotage, these secret rebel networks engage in psychological warfare. They distribute pamphlets and graffiti to inspire hope among the British population, urging them to resist the Nazi occupiers. These messages remind the people of Britain that their homeland is not fully conquered and that the fight for freedom is still ongoing. In addition, these underground groups provide crucial intelligence to the Allied forces, who rely on the information to plan strategic moves in the war. Whether it is the locations of enemy forces or the state of German morale, the partisans are a vital source of resistance intelligence. While the British partisans face constant danger, they find allies in other underground movements throughout Europe. They exchange information, strategies, and resources with the French resistance, the Polish underground, and other anti-Nazi forces. These networks of solidarity create a web of resistance that weakens Nazi control across the continent, one act of defiance at a time. Despite the harsh reprisals by the German occupiers, the British partisans proved that even in the darkest days, there is always hope for resistance. They may be small in number, but their actions are significant, contributing to the eventual overthrow of Nazi rule in Britain. Allied attempts to undermine German control. Following the fall of Britain to Nazi Germany, the Allies regroup and refocus their efforts on the broader war effort, determined to reverse the tide of Nazi domination across Europe. Though Britain is occupied, the war is far from over, and the Allies are resolved to launch a series of covert operations aimed at undermining German control and weakening the Axis powers from within. These efforts focus on a variety of tactics, including sabotage, intelligence operations, and support for resistance movements across Europe. One of the most critical aspects of the Allied strategy is to continue supporting underground resistance movements in occupied territories, including Britain. Despite the German occupation, the Allies maintain contact with British partisans and work to provide them with the necessary tools, weapons, and intelligence to carry out sabotage missions against the Nazi forces. This secret support comes from various intelligence agencies, including Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE, which is tasked with organizing and directing resistance cells. These partisans, though limited in number, continue to disrupt German operations, targeting key infrastructure and spreading unrest among the civilian population. The Allies use these efforts to maintain hope in the face of occupation, reminding both the British people and the larger world that the Nazis are not invincible. Meanwhile, the Allies focus on targeting German supply chains, which are vital for sustaining the war effort. Operations like the bombing raids conducted by the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the U.S. Army Air Forces are aimed at destroying factories, refineries, and transportation hubs in Nazi-occupied territories, particularly in Western Europe. While these efforts inflict significant damage, they also require extensive planning and coordination to minimize civilian casualties and disrupt the German war machine without inciting more brutal reprisals. The strategic bombing campaigns, though costly, become one of the primary means through which the Allies aim to damage German military strength and morale. Intelligence gathering plays a significant role in these Allied efforts to undermine German control. The British and American intelligence services work tirelessly to infiltrate Nazi networks and gather crucial information. This includes espionage activities, such as planting agents within German-controlled territories and intercepting German communications. By gaining access to classified Nazi information, the Allies are able to undermine German operations and anticipate their next moves. This intelligence also informs Allied planning, paving the way for more effective military strategies in the coming years. Though the Axis powers hold Britain under a tight grip, these Allied attempts to subvert and weaken German control demonstrate the enduring resistance to Nazi rule. By targeting infrastructure, providing vital support to resistance movements, and gathering intelligence, the Allies strive to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Their actions, though not immediately decisive, gradually erode the foundation of German power, contributing to the eventual downfall of the Nazi regime. Assassination plots and sabotage efforts. In the dark and dangerous days following Britain's fall to Nazi occupation, one of the most daring and high-risk strategies employed by the Allies and resistance groups is the targeted assassination of high-ranking Nazi officials and key figures within the German military. These assassination plots are driven by the belief that removing certain individuals could destabilize the German war effort, undermine morale, and ultimately bring about the collapse of Nazi control over Britain. The first of these efforts is aimed at Nazi officers stationed in the UK and the continent. Working from the shadows, British partisans, in collaboration with intelligence agencies like the SOE, begin to target individuals such as military leaders, Gestapo officers, and other high-ranking Nazi officials whose presence in occupied Britain ensures the smooth operation of German control. These plots are meticulously planned, often involving covert infiltration into the heart of German territory, and are executed with the hope that eliminating key figures could spark a larger uprising or simply sow confusion within the enemy ranks. While few of these assassination attempts are successful in their immediate aftermath, they are not without effect. The fear instilled in Nazi leadership due to the constant threat of death becomes palpable, contributing to the paranoia that permeates the occupation. Alongside assassination, sabotage becomes a critical part of the resistance efforts. Underground groups across Britain, often working in secret coordination with foreign allies, engage in operations designed to destroy the very infrastructure that supports Nazi military operations. These sabotage efforts range from small acts of destruction, such as the cutting of telephone lines or the derailing of trains, to large-scale attacks on factories and military bases. The goal is always the same: disrupt the German war effort, inflict material losses, and weaken their grip on the country. One of the most daring sabotage missions occurs when a group of partisans successfully infiltrates a German munitions factory, planting explosives that destroy a critical shipment of weapons intended for the Eastern Front. Though the damage to the German military is significant, the success of these operations is not without heavy consequences. The Nazis often respond with brutal reprisals, executing civilians or imprisoning suspected traitors to send a chilling message. Still, these acts of defiance serve to keep the flames of resistance alive. The assassination plots and sabotage efforts contribute to a larger psychological warfare campaign against the Nazi regime. Though they may not immediately cripple Germany's military dominance, these actions continually undermine their control and provide a glimmer of hope to the British population still resisting occupation. The combined impact of these operations, despite their risks and casualties, plays a role in disrupting Nazi stability. The effort to weaken the invaders through these covert, often deadly means continues as part of the long struggle to reclaim Britain from its occupiers. Chapter 12: The Long-Term Consequences. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany and the subsequent occupation would have far-reaching and lasting consequences, both for the European continent and the global order. While the immediate effects of Britain's defeat were felt in terms of military strategy and Nazi expansion, the long-term repercussions of this shift in power played a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of the 20th century. These consequences permeated various aspects of international politics, military strategies, and even cultural identity, forever altering the balance of power. One of the most significant long-term consequences of Britain's fall was the shift in global influence. With Britain no longer a viable world power, Germany assumed an even greater leadership role in Europe, leading to an era of Nazi-dominated European politics. This dominance extended beyond Britain, as Germany imposed its control over neighboring countries, reshaping the political and economic landscape of Europe. Former British colonies, now vulnerable without their former protector, faced an uncertain future. The Axis powers, including Italy and Japan, saw the fall of Britain as an opportunity to expand their own empires. The United States, though still maintaining its isolationist stance for a time, found itself increasingly at odds with this new Axis-led world order, pushing its leadership into eventual conflict with Germany and Japan. For the people of Britain, the Nazi occupation had long-lasting effects on their cultural and political landscape. The loss of independence, the suppression of free speech, and the ongoing terror of occupation shaped the psyche of a generation. In the years following the occupation, Britain struggled to rebuild its sense of national identity, deeply scarred by the experience of defeat. While the underground resistance kept hope alive, many were forced to reconcile with the reality of living under an authoritarian regime. The cultural repression led to a loss of British identity, replaced by a new, darker vision of governance in a post-war Europe. On the military front, the fall of Britain led to significant changes in the course of the Second World War. The Nazi regime with access to Britain's resources and strategic locations, positioned itself to launch further campaigns against the Soviet Union and other Allied nations. This shift altered the Eastern Front significantly, forcing the Soviet Union to fight a much stronger enemy. Moreover, the destruction of the British military meant that Germany was able to devote more resources to its war efforts, giving them an edge in several key campaigns. In terms of the global economy, the reordering of the European order under Nazi control disrupted global trade routes and markets, affecting not only European countries, but also former British colonies. The economic ramifications of Britain's fall reverberated across the Atlantic, leading to shifts in global markets and political allegiances that would define the post-war world. The shape of a Nazi-dominated world. A world dominated by Nazi Germany would have profoundly altered the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the 20th century. With Britain's fall, the Nazis gained unprecedented control over much of Europe, and their reach extended across the globe. Hitler's vision for a new world order, rooted in fascist ideology, racial hierarchy, and imperialism, would become the framework through which global politics were reshaped. In Europe, the Nazi regime's vision of Germanization would be forcibly implemented, as Germany's control over occupied territories was marked by harsh oppression and aggressive assimilation policies. The people of occupied nations were subjected to brutal treatment, including forced labor, mass deportations, and systematic persecution of ethnic minorities, particularly Jews. Germany's economic dominance would transform the European continent, with the Nazis imposing trade policies that would benefit German industry at the expense of the conquered nations. Strategic territories like the French coastline, vital for controlling the Atlantic, and the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, would be prioritized for exploitation. The collapse of British resistance also meant the abandonment of the British Empire, leading to an era of decolonization under Nazi terms. Former colonies, deprived of their mother country's support, would find themselves vulnerable to both Axis pressure and their own internal struggles for autonomy. German imperial ambitions could have expanded beyond Europe, as the Nazis eyed territories in Africa and Asia, seeking to reshape global trade and resources in their favor. The United States, though still a power on the world stage, would have found itself facing an increasingly powerful Axis bloc, forcing a reevaluation of its foreign policy and military strategy. Culturally, a Nazi-dominated world would be marked by the imposition of Nazi propaganda and the repression of dissent. The arts, education, and media would be subjected to strict censorship, with only ideas that fit into the Nazi ideology of Aryan supremacy being promoted. Global science and technology would also be steered towards military objectives, as the Nazis pushed for advances that would ensure their continued dominance. The international political system would shift dramatically, with the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, setting the terms for global diplomacy. Any remaining democracies would be marginalized, forced into submission, or isolated in a world where autocracy and totalitarianism reigned. The geopolitical balance of power would have been tilted in favor of totalitarian regimes, and the struggle for freedom and democracy would become the rallying cry of any resistance that remained in the shadows of the Nazi Empire. The cultural and political impact of a fallen Britain. The fall of Britain to Nazi Germany would have reverberated far beyond military defeat, reshaping both the cultural and political fabric of the world. As the former heart of the British Empire fell under Axis control, the loss would not only mark a seismic shift in the balance of power, but would also have profound implications for global ideals of democracy, freedom, and human rights. Politically, the collapse of Britain would dismantle the last significant obstacle to the full realization of Hitler's vision for Europe. Without the United Kingdom as a counterweight, the Nazi regime would have imposed its authoritarian model on much of Europe and beyond. The loss of Britain's influence would leave many nations in the Commonwealth in a state of political limbo. Countries that once looked to Britain for leadership would find themselves increasingly vulnerable to Nazi domination or influence. Former colonies, deprived of their protector, would have to contend with either a new form of imperialism under Germany or struggle for autonomy in a world ruled by totalitarianism. Culturally, Britain's fall would send shockwaves through the artistic and intellectual communities. British culture, once a beacon of democratic values, artistic expression, and scientific progress, would be overshadowed by the rigid and oppressive ideology of Nazi rule. Writers, artists, and intellectuals who championed individualism and freedom of thought would be suppressed or forced into exile, their works censored, as the Nazis sought to impose their own vision of art and culture. In Britain, Nazi occupiers would likely attempt to erase or rewrite the nation's cultural history, replacing it with propaganda that suited their narrative. Monuments, literature, and educational institutions would be repurposed to align with the Nazi agenda, diminishing Britain's role in shaping global culture. The loss of Britain would also affect global perceptions of democracy. As one of the oldest and most revered democratic institutions in the world, Britain's fall would send a chilling message about the vulnerability of democratic nations to totalitarianism. Nations that had relied on Britain for moral and military support might find themselves questioning their ability to resist the rise of autocracy. The idea of liberty and self-determination, core tenets of British influence, would become ideals in desperate need of defense. Ultimately, the cultural and political impact of a fallen Britain would not only reshape the destiny of Europe, but would also leave a lasting mark on the broader world order. The defeat of Britain would signal the end of one era and the beginning of another, where the struggle for democratic values would take on a new urgency. Alternate futures. Could the Allies still win? Even after Britain's fall to Nazi Germany, the possibility of an Allied victory would not have been entirely ruled out. Though the Axis powers would have been in a significantly stronger position, history shows that the tides of war are rarely predictable, and several factors could still have played a crucial role in determining the eventual outcome. The question of whether the Allies could still win hinges on numerous variables, from global alliances to technological advancements and the resilience of resistance movements. One of the most critical factors would be the involvement of the United States. While the U.S. had remained isolated in the early years of the war, their potential intervention could have shifted the course of events. With Britain falling, American policymakers would likely have recognized the threat posed by the dominant Axis power and would have been compelled to increase military and financial support to any remaining opposition forces, whether in the form of the Soviet Union, the Resistance, or what was left of the Commonwealth. A stronger, more decisive American entry into the war could have led to a drawn-out struggle, tying down German forces in multiple theaters of war and preventing their total dominance of Europe. The Soviet Union's position would also have remained pivotal. Despite initial setbacks in their conflict with Germany, the vast size of the Soviet Union, along with its industrial capacity and massive population, would have made a continued fight possible. The USSR could have served as a crucial bulwark against Nazi expansion in the East, even without the support of Britain. If the United States could provide indirect assistance, such as through arms or supplies, a second front against Nazi forces would still have remained viable, though it would have been a protracted and brutal struggle. Another possibility would be the persistence of resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. The fall of Britain would not have eradicated the spirit of defiance against Nazi oppression. Underground networks in France, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe, supported by remaining Allied nations, could have carried out sabotage, intelligence gathering, and targeted attacks that drained the resources of the Axis powers. Over time, these movements might have destabilized Nazi control, much like how the Viet Cong had crippled the United States' efforts in Vietnam decades later. In this altered reality, a combination of sustained resistance, Soviet resilience, and an increasingly active United States could have created enough pressure to eventually turn the tide, despite the Axis powers' initial advantages. While the war's outcome would have been far from certain, the potential for an Allied victory remained, contingent on the continued determination and cooperation of the global resistance to Nazi rule. Conclusion: the success of Operation Sea Lion and the subsequent fall of Britain to Nazi Germany would have undeniably reshaped the world in profound and unimaginable ways. The repercussions of such an event would have extended far beyond the borders of the British Isles, impacting the course of the Second World War and the future of the global order. The world would have witnessed a dramatically altered balance of power, with Nazi Germany consolidating its dominance over Europe and the British Empire severely crippled. Yet, even in the face of such a setback, the determination of the Allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, could have offered a glimmer of hope. The war was not solely defined by any single battle or campaign, but by the resilience, innovation, and unity of those who opposed the Axis powers. The collapse of Britain would not have marked the end of resistance, nor would it have sealed the fate of the Allies. The Second World War was, after all, a struggle of ideologies and sheer willpower, with both sides constantly adapting to new challenges. The Nazi occupation of Britain would have irrevocably altered the cultural and political landscape of the world. The British Empire's decline would have left a power vacuum, allowing for the rise of new global powers or the further entrenchment of Nazi hegemony. At the same time, the very nature of global warfare would have shifted. The rise of a Nazi-dominated Europe, alongside its global ambitions, would have created new fronts and theaters of conflict that could have ignited new forms of resistance and intervention. However, this alternate history also reminds us of the fragility of historical outcomes. What seemed like a pivotal turning point, the success of Operation Sea Lion, was in reality a narrow margin of victory for the Axis powers, dependent on numerous variables. The Allies' eventual victory, whether through direct military intervention, economic resilience, or the determination of resistance fighters, might still have been possible. This serves as a testament to the unpredictable nature of history, where even the most decisive victories can be undone by shifting alliances, unforeseen events, and the persistence of those who refuse to surrender. In the end, the fall of Britain would have been a momentous event, but it would not have sealed the fate of the free world. It would have been but another chapter in the long, complex struggle between tyranny and freedom. A reminder that the course of history is shaped not only by those who hold power, but also by those who rise up to challenge it.